Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a journey, but it's not the journey that was planned. It's a story about what happens when the plan, a very, very grand plan, goes completely and spectacularly wrong in the most hostile place on the planet. It's a story about a wooden ship, 28 men, and a leader whose real genius only showed up when every single one of his dreams had been crushed. We're going to talk about the incredible resilience and sheer stubborn grit of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance. It's one of the greatest survival stories ever told, and it all begins long before their ship ever touched the ice. As always, if you enjoy what I do here, a quiet little click on the like or subscribe button is always appreciated, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing. It's just nice to know you're out there, and I'm always curious to know where you're all listening from. It's a quiet little global community we have here, all settling down for the night, so drop a comment if you feel like it. But for now, the housekeeping is over. It's time to let the day go. Dim the lights, pull up the covers. Maybe find that perfect cool spot on your pillow. Let your breathing slow down, and just let my voice be a soft background hum. We're not here to study for a test. We're just here to drift. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Back to a time of heroes, wooden ships, and the last great blank space on the map. Chapter 1. The Last Age of Heroes. There's a photograph from the very early 20th century. It's of a city street, maybe London or New York. The men are in top hats and long coats, the women in corsets and vast, complicated dresses. There are horses pulling carriages, clattering on cobblestones, right next to the occasional sputtering, primitive automobile that looks more like a motorized bathtub. It's a world that feels both deeply familiar and impossibly distant. It's a world caught between two ages, the old world of steam and empire, of tradition and rigid social structures, and the new modern world of electricity, mass communication and machines that would soon change the very nature of conflict and society itself. This was the world in 1914, a world brimming with a kind of confident, almost naive optimism. Science was unlocking the secrets of the universe, technology was shrinking the globe, and for the British Empire, which still painted a quarter of the world map a confident shade of pink, there was a sense that there was no challenge humanity, and specifically British humanity, couldn't overcome with enough pluck, determination, and a properly starched collar. And yet, for all this progress, there were still places on that map marked with a simple, tantalizing phrase: unexplored territory, the deepest jungles of the Amazon, the vast empty quarters of the great deserts, but most of all the poles, the Arctic, and especially the Antarctic, the seventh continent, a place so alien, so hostile, it was less a part of our world, and more like a visiting planet that had parked itself at the bottom of the globe. For the public of that era, Antarctica held the same kind of mystique that outer space would for their grandchildren. It was the final frontier, the last great unconquered prize in an age of conquest. To go there was to step off the known world. The men who dared to try were not just scientists or adventurers. They were astronauts in tweed and wool. They were national heroes, their faces staring out from newspapers and cigarette cards. Their public lectures, where they would stand on a stage with a flickering magic lantern show of grainy black and white photographs of ice and penguins, were sold-out events. Schoolchildren followed their progress as if it were the most important sporting event in the world, because, in a way, it was. This period, roughly from the late 1890s to the early 1920s, has a name. It's called the Heroic Age of Antarctic Exploration, and the name is telling. It wasn't called the Scientific Age or the Efficient Age. It was the Heroic Age. The emphasis was on the human drama, the sheer physical and mental struggle of man against the raw, untamable power of nature. The technology of the day was in a strange halfway house. They had steam-powered ships, yes, but these ships were made of wood. They had canned food, but the science of nutrition, particularly the vital importance of vitamins to prevent diseases like scurvy, was still in its infancy, a murky world of guesswork and bitter experience. Their gear was the absolute best that money could buy in 1914, which is to say, by our standards, it was comically, terrifyingly inadequate. Forget breathable Gore-Tex and lightweight fleece. Their idea of high-tech outerwear was a multi-layered affair of wool, tweed, and Burberry gabardine, a fabric treated to be water-resistant. It was heavy when dry and unimaginably heavy when wet. On their feet, they wore leather ski boots studded with nails for grip, which offered about as much insulation as a pair of dress shoes. Their sleeping bags were often made of reindeer hide. This sounds wonderfully rustic and cozy, like something from a Scandinavian fairy tale, until you realized that the moisture from your own breath and body would freeze inside the hide overnight, turning your cozy bag into a rigid, icy coffin that you'd have to painstakingly thaw out every morning. They navigated with a sextant and a chronometer, relying on a clear view of the sun, a luxury the Antarctic weather rarely afforded. Their communication with the outside world, once they set foot on the ice, was precisely zero. No radio, no satellite phone, no emergency beacon. They would disappear for 1, 2, maybe 3 years, and the world would simply have to wait, hoping for the best, until their ship reappeared on the horizon like a ghost, or didn't. And the method of travel across the ice? The primary engine of the heroic age was the human body. The verb they used was man-hauling. This involved strapping yourself into a leather harness, leaning forward until your face was just inches from the snow, and pulling a heavy wooden sledge laden with hundreds of pounds of supplies, day after day, for hundreds of miles. It was brutal, soul-crushing work, a form of self-inflicted torture performed in the name of glory and discovery. It was this struggle, this almost romantic ideal of suffering and endurance, that defined the era, and at the heart of it all was one singular glittering prize, the South Pole. By the early 1910s, the race to be the first human being to stand at the bottom of the world had become a fierce international obsession, a kind of Cold War played out on the ice, and it had boiled down to 2 men, 2 teams, 2 utterly different philosophies of exploration. They were the 2 ghosts who would haunt the ambitions of every explorer who came after them, especially Ernest Shackleton. They were the Norwegian Roald Amundsen and the British naval officer Robert Falcon Scott. You couldn't have invented 2 characters more perfectly suited to represent their respective national temperaments. Amundsen was the ultimate professional, a polar pragmatist. He was a student of the ice. He had spent time living with the Inuit people in the Arctic and had absorbed their centuries of accumulated wisdom. He understood that you didn't conquer the cold, you adapted to it, you respected it. He viewed the race to the pole not as a romantic quest, but as a logistical problem to be solved with ruthless efficiency. His approach was a masterclass in planning. He placed his supply depots with mathematical precision. His equipment was meticulously tested and modified. He understood the superiority of loose-fitting furs over the tight, sweat-trapping wool favoured by the British, and most crucially, he put his faith not in men, but in dogs. He assembled teams of Greenland huskies, not just to pull the sledges, but as a crucial part of a grimly practical plan. The dogs were a living, mobile food source. On the return journey, weaker dogs would be killed to feed the stronger ones, and to feed the men. It was a brutal calculus, one that horrified the dog-loving British public, but it was brutally effective. For Amundsen, sentimentality was a liability, a dead weight on the sledge. His goal was simple: get to the pole first, and get everyone home alive. And then there was Scott. Captain Robert Falcon Scott of the Royal Navy. He was the embodiment of the British officer class. Brave, stoic, a man who believed deeply in duty, honour, and the virtues of the stiff upper lip. To the British public he was the hero of the story. But where Amundsen was adaptable, Scott was rigid. He was a product of the naval hierarchy, a man more comfortable with command and tradition than with the kind of improvisation the Antarctic demanded. Scott's expedition was a grand imperial undertaking, but it was plagued by a tragic series of what we might politely call questionable choices. He was sceptical of the effectiveness of dogs, viewing man-hauling as somehow more noble, a purer test of the British spirit. He put some of his faith in shaggy Manchurian ponies, which were completely unsuited to the deep snow and freezing temperatures. They sank into the drifts, their sweat froze on their hides, and they had to be shot long before they reached the polar plateau, leaving the men to take up the traces. He also brought along a handful of experimental motorized sledges. This was a bold nod to the new machine age, a fantastic idea on paper. In the crushing cold of the Antarctic interior, however, the engines quickly failed, their metal parts becoming brittle and cracking. The machines were abandoned, monuments to a future that hadn't quite arrived, leaving the men once again to haul everything by hand. The story of their race has become a legend, a kind of cautionary fable. In December of 1911, Amundsen and his small, efficient team arrived at the South Pole. They planted the Norwegian flag, took their measurements, and made a swift, uneventful return to their base, their dogs pulling them to safety. They had made it look almost easy. Just over a month later, on a bitter day in January 1912, Scott and his 4 companions arrived at the same spot. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and running low on food and fuel. And there, fluttering in the relentless polar wind, they saw it, the Norwegian flag, Amundsen's tent, the crushing, soul-destroying proof that they were second. The entry in Scott's diary is one of the most heartbreaking passages in the literature of exploration. The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority. Their return journey was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. One man, Edgar Evans, collapsed and died. Another, Captain Lawrence Oates, suffering from a gangrenous foot, and knowing he was slowing his companions down, famously walked out of their tent into a blizzard, saying, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." It was the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, a line that would be memorized by generations of British schoolchildren. The last three, Scott, Birdie Bowers, and Edward Wilson, perished in their tent, trapped by a blizzard, just 11 miles short of a massive supply depot that would have saved them. They starved and froze to death, huddled together in their frozen sleeping bags. When a search party found their bodies months later, they also found Scott's journals, which chronicled their ordeal with a kind of spare, heartbreaking eloquence. The news, when it finally reached the outside world, created a sensation. Amundsen, the victor, was respected for his incredible achievement, but he was never beloved. He was seen as a bit too professional, a bit too unsporting. But Scott, in death, became a martyr, a national icon. His failure was reframed as a glorious tragedy, a testament to the indomitable spirit of men who would rather die than give up. His story cemented the Antarctic in the public imagination as a place that demanded not just skill, but a willingness to pay the ultimate price. It set an impossibly high bar for heroism and sacrifice. And it is this context, this world of glory, tragedy, and intense public expectation that we must understand to understand the man who was waiting in the wings, watching it all unfold. He was a man who had served under Scott on his first expedition, a man who had tasted the Antarctic air and felt its bite, and who was consumed by a burning, restless ambition to carve his own name into the ice. His name was Ernest Shackleton. If Scott was the quintessential naval officer, and Amundsen the cool-headed professional, Shackleton was something else entirely. He was a romantic, a poet, a born showman, and perhaps the most charismatic and persuasive man ever to don a pair of snow goggles. He wasn't English gentry, he was Anglo-Irish, born in County Kildare and raised in London. He didn't come up through the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy. He joined the Merchant Navy at 16, learning the ways of the sea and of men on the grimy decks of tramp steamers. He was more of an entrepreneur than an officer, a man who dreamed big and then had the incredible talent of convincing other people to pay for his dreams. He had a restless energy, a twinkle in his eye, and a profound understanding of human psychology. He knew how to inspire loyalty, how to soothe frayed nerves, and how to keep spirits up when things looked bleak. He was a brilliant storyteller, a man who could hold a room captive with his tales of adventure, and he was driven, deeply, personally driven. His Antarctic career began, ironically, in the shadow of Robert Falcon Scott. In 1901, Shackleton was chosen as a junior officer on Scott's first expedition, the Discovery Expedition. It was his first taste of the Great White South, and he was enthralled. But the expedition ended for him in personal humiliation. He, along with Scott and Wilson, made an attempt to push south towards the pole, a brutal journey that left all three men weak and suffering from the early stages of scurvy. Shackleton, who was physically a big, robust man, seemed to be hit the hardest. Scott, perhaps seeing him as a rival, or perhaps genuinely concerned for his health, made the decision to invalidate him and send him home early on a relief ship. For a man as proud and ambitious as Shackleton, this was a devastating blow. To be sent home as unwell, to be seen as the weak link, lit a fire in him that would never go out. He returned to Britain a minor celebrity, but in his own mind he was a failure. He had a score to settle, not necessarily with Scott, but with the continent that had bested him, and with the perception that he didn't have what it took. So he set about organising his own expedition. This was the Nimrod expedition of 1907. This time he was the leader, he was the boss, a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life. And on this journey, he showed the world the kind of leader he truly was. He was an innovator, less bound by tradition than Scott. He took ponies like Scott, but he also took one of the first motor cars to the continent. Another magnificent failure in the extreme cold, but proof of his willingness to try new things. The goal, of course, was the pole. Shackleton and three companions, Frank Wild, Eric Marshall, and Jameson Adams, set out on another grueling man-hauling journey. They pushed themselves and their dwindling supplies to the absolute limit. They pioneered a new route up the colossal Beardmore Glacier, a river of ice riddled with treacherous crevasses. They reached the vast wind-swept emptiness of the polar plateau, and they got closer to the pole than anyone had ever been before. They reached a latitude of 88 degrees 23 south, just 97 nautical miles from their goal. 97 miles, after marching for months, after enduring starvation rations and blinding blizzards. They were just a few days' march from eternal glory. And it was here that Shackleton made the decision that would define his life and his leadership. He looked at his men. They were at the ragged edge of their endurance. He looked at their meagre supplies. He did the grim math. He knew that if they made a final desperate dash for the pole, they might just make it. But they would never ever make it back. They would die on the return journey. So he turned back. In that moment of supreme temptation, he chose his men's lives over the prize. He later wrote to his wife, Emily, "I thought you would rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." It was a decision of incredible moral courage. He returned to Britain a hero. He was knighted by the king. He had achieved the furthest south. But in the quiet moments he knew the truth. He hadn't finished the job. The pole was still unclaimed. And then, just a few years later, came the news. First, that Amundsen had reached it. Then, the shocking, tragic news of Scott's death on the return journey. The two great polar prizes, first to the pole and the tragic heroic failure, had both been claimed. For any other explorer, the story might have seemed over. The great race was done. What was left to do? For a mind like Shackleton's, a mind that thrived on grand challenges and the seemingly impossible, the answer was obvious. You simply had to invent a bigger, bolder, more audacious goal. If you couldn't be the first to reach the pole, you would be the first to cross the entire continent. This was the genesis of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. One ship, the Endurance, would sail into the treacherous, ice-choked Weddell Sea, a part of the Antarctic coast that was notoriously difficult and largely unknown. Shackleton and a small party would land and then set out on an 100-mile journey on foot, with dog teams across the entire landmass of Antarctica. They would march up the glaciers, across the polar plateau, past the South Pole itself, and then down the other side to Ross Island, where a second ship, the Aurora, would have landed a support party to lay supply depots for the final leg of their journey. It was, as Shackleton himself billed it, the last great journey on Earth. It was a plan with so many moving parts, so many opportunities for catastrophic failure, that it seems almost insane in retrospect. The Weddell Sea Party and the Ross Sea Party would be on opposite sides of the continent, completely unable to communicate with each other. The success of the Transcontinental Party depended entirely on the Ross Sea Party successfully laying their depots, a heroic journey in its own right. And the entire endeavour depended on the Endurance safely landing the shore party and then getting out of the Weddell Sea ice before winter froze it in. It was a brilliant, magnificent, and terrifyingly fragile plan. And the first great obstacle wasn't the ice or the cold or the vast distances, it was money. Polar exploration in the heroic age was an astonishingly expensive business. It was the equivalent of a private space program today. You needed a specialized ship, tons of custom-made equipment, years' worth of supplies, scientific instruments, dogs, and the salaries for a crew of highly skilled men. And Shackleton, unlike Scott, who had the backing of the Royal Geographical Society and the Admiralty, was essentially a freelance adventurer. He was, in modern parlance, a startup founder looking for venture capital. So he began the hustle. It was a performance he had perfected over the years. He wrote thousands of letters. He gave lectures. He cornered wealthy industrialists at their gentlemen's clubs, painting a vivid picture of imperial glory and the thrill of the unknown. He was a master salesman, selling a product that was intangible, incredibly risky, and offered no financial return on investment, only a share in the glory. He charmed and cajoled. He exaggerated, and he inspired. His optimism was his greatest currency. The fundraising was a grueling, nerve-wracking affair. He was constantly on the brink of financial collapse. He secured a modest grant from the British government, but it was far from enough. A huge chunk of the funding came from a single source, a wealthy industrialist named Sir James Caird, a Scottish jute manufacturer. Caird was a gruff, no-nonsense businessman, but he was captivated by Shackleton's vision. His large donation effectively saved the expedition from foundering before it even began. Another significant donation came from Dudley Docker of the Birmingham Small Arms Company, and a woman named Janet Stancombe Wills, a tobacco heiress, also became a major patron. Shackleton was so grateful he would later name one of the lifeboats after her. Even the public chipped in. He appealed to the nation's children, and they sent in their pocket money, shillings and pence, to help fund the great adventure. But even with these major backers, the expedition was run on a shoestring. Shackleton was buying supplies on credit, promising to pay the bills with the proceeds from the books, films and lecture tours that would follow their triumphant return. The entire enterprise was a massive financial gamble, balanced on the hope of future success. While Shackleton was playing the part of the CEO and fundraiser, he also had to find his most crucial piece of equipment, his ship. He found her in a shipyard in Sandefjord, Norway, the global capital of whaling and polar shipbuilding. She had been designed by a master shipwright named Ole Anderod Larsen for the purpose of taking wealthy tourists on Arctic cruises, a kind of polar bear hunting safari. She was originally named Polaris. Shackleton knew at once that she was the ship he needed. He bought her and rechristened her Endurance, a name that would become one of the most resonant and fitting in maritime history. The name came from his own family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. It was a perfect encapsulation of his philosophy. The Endurance was not an icebreaker in the modern sense of a steel-hulled behemoth that smashes its way through the ice. She was what they called an ice cheater. Her design was a masterpiece of wooden shipbuilding, engineered specifically to survive the immense crushing pressure of the polar pack ice. Every timber was chosen for its strength. Her keel was made from 4 solid pieces of oak, one on top of the other, to a thickness of over 7 feet. Her frames were made of Norwegian fir, and her outer hull was sheathed in greenheart, a South American timber so dense and hard that you couldn't hammer a nail into it without drilling a hole first. Her bow, the part that would make first contact with the ice, was over 4 feet thick, but her real genius was in her shape. Her hull was not straight-sided like a normal vessel. It was rounded, almost like a bowl. The idea was that if the pack ice closed in around her, the pressure wouldn't crush her sides. Instead, it would squeeze her upwards, lifting her out of the water to rest safely on the surface of the ice, like a watermelon seed squeezed between your fingers. This was the theory, anyway. She was, everyone agreed, the strongest wooden ship of her size ever built. She was their ark, their fortress, their floating home, their only link to the world they were leaving behind. She was a character in this story, as vital as any of the men. With the money more or less secured, and the ship being refitted in London, Shackleton turned to his final and most important task, selecting his crew. He needed 27 men to join him on the Endurance, 27 men who would have to live and work together in unimaginably close quarters, under extreme pressure for years on end. A now famous advertisement is said to have been placed in the London newspapers, though its actual existence is a matter of some historical debate. Whether it's real or apocryphal, it perfectly captures the spirit of the undertaking. It supposedly read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition, in case of success." The response was overwhelming. More than 5,000 men applied. They came from all walks of life. There were university students looking for adventure, seasoned sailors, toughs from the London docks, and gentlemen of leisure, tired of their comfortable lives. They were all drawn by the siren call of the last great adventure. Shackleton's interview process was famously eccentric. He was less interested in a man's resume than in his character. He would ask strange, disarming questions to see how a candidate reacted under pressure. He was casting a psychological drama, and he needed the right mix of personalities. He looked for optimists. He had a theory that optimists were not only better for morale, but they were also more resistant to diseases like scurvy. He looked for men with hobbies and passions outside of their professional skills. Could they sing? Could they play the banjo? Could they tell a good joke? He knew that in the long, dark polar night, a good banjo player was worth more than a dozen grumbling experts. He'd ask a candidate if he could sing. If the man nervously croaked out a few off-key lines, Shackleton was impressed. It showed he wasn't afraid to make a fool of himself. He was looking for what we would now call psychological resilience. He needed men who wouldn't crack when the world was reduced to a cramped wooden hut surrounded by an infinity of ice. Slowly he assembled his cast. Each man was chosen for a specific role, but also for that indefinable quality that Shackleton sensed they would need. His second-in-command was a man he trusted implicitly, Frank Wild. Wild was a veteran of both Scott's Discovery expedition and Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. He was quiet, loyal, and utterly unflappable. Where Shackleton was the charismatic visionary leader, Wild was the steady, operational manager who got things done. He was the rock upon which Shackleton would build his expedition. Then there was the photographer, Frank Hurley. Hurley was an Australian, a daredevil, and a photographic genius. He was as tough as any of the sailors, an adventurer in his own right who would climb to the most precarious perches on the ship's rigging during a gale just to get the perfect shot. His job was not just to document the journey for science, but to capture the drama, the heroism, the images that would be sold to newspapers and turned into a feature film to help pay off the expedition's massive debts. The incredible images we have of this story are thanks to his artistry and his sheer nerve. The crew was a carefully chosen cross-section of Edwardian Britain. There were the officers and scientists, the gentlemen of the expedition, men like Reginald James, the physicist, and James Wordie, the geologist. There was Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, who brought his 5-string banjo with him, a decision Shackleton heartily approved of, and which would prove to be an invaluable piece of survival equipment. There was also Thomas Ord-Leys, the motor expert in charge of the not-very-good motor sledge, who was also a physical fitness fanatic. He was a slightly awkward, socially inept character, often the butt of jokes, but he was tough and resilient. And then there was the lower deck, the sailors, stokers and craftsmen, who would do the hard physical work of running the ship. Men like Tom Crean, a tough-as-nails Irishman, and another Antarctic veteran who had been with Scott on both his expeditions and had won a medal for bravery on the last one. And there was Harry Chippy McNish, the ship's carpenter, a master of his craft, a proud, dour Scotsman who loved his cat, Mrs. Chippy, who was in fact a male cat, and who had little patience for the niceties of naval hierarchy. His skills as a shipwright would prove to be more critical to their survival than anyone could possibly have imagined. It was a motley collection of individuals, veterans and novices, scientists and sailors, jokers and curmudgeons, but Shackleton saw in them the right stuff. He believed he had assembled the finest crew ever to head south. By the summer of 1914, the preparations were reaching a frantic peak. The Endurance was loaded with supplies. There were tons of coal, specially designed sledges, prefabricated huts to be erected on the ice, and enough food for 3 years. The 69 Canadian sled dogs, a noisy, chaotic and vital part of the team, were brought aboard. The ship was a hive of activity, a floating island of purpose and excitement. But as they prepared to sail off the edge of the world they were leaving behind was about to set itself on fire. Throughout that summer, the political tensions in Europe had been escalating. An archduke had been assassinated in a place called Sarajevo. A complex web of alliances and treaties was being triggered. The headlines in the newspapers alongside the updates on Shackleton's preparations grew darker and more ominous. On August 1st, 1914, the Endurance sailed from London. The crowds cheered. It was a day of celebration. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France. The next day, Britain declared war on Germany. The world was at war. Shackleton immediately found himself in an agonizing position. He was on the verge of realizing his life's ambition, but his country was now engaged in a conflict that would demand the service of every able-bodied man and every useful ship. He did what he felt was his duty. He sent a telegram to the Admiralty, placing the Endurance, its crew, its supplies, everything, at the disposal of the war effort. He would put his dream on hold for his country. He waited for the reply, assuming the great journey was over before it had even begun. The reply came back. It was from the First Lord of the Admiralty, a man named Winston Churchill. It contained a single, emphatic word: proceed. A few days later, a final message came from the King himself, wishing them Godspeed. The message was clear. In a world that was about to be consumed by the grim, mechanized slaughter of modern warfare, there was still value in a quest like this, perhaps now more than ever. The expedition was a symbol of an older kind of courage, of human endeavour against the clean, impartial adversary of nature, not against other men. And so they went. On August 8th, 1914, the Endurance weighed anchor and sailed from Plymouth. As she slipped out of the harbour and into the English Channel, her crew was looking south towards the ice. But behind them they were leaving a world that by the time any of them saw it again, would be changed forever. They were sailing out of the Edwardian era, out of the heroic age, They were a tiny, self-contained bubble of the old world, heading for the end of the earth, while the modern world began the grim business of tearing itself apart. They were the last of their kind, on the last great journey, and none of them, least of all Shackleton himself, could ever have imagined what that journey would truly demand of them. Chapter 2. Into the Jaws of the Weddell Sea. And so they sailed on, a tiny wooden ship, a microcosm of an era, pointed towards a blank space on the map. The world they left behind was already forgetting them, consumed by the thunder of guns in Flanders. But on the Endurance, the only thunder was the sound of the ocean and the steady, reassuring thump of the ship's engine. Their journey south was, for a time, blessedly uneventful. They stopped in Buenos Aires for final supplies and to take on a few last-minute crew members, and one very important stowaway, a young man named Percy Blackborough, who was discovered hiding in a locker. Shackleton, a man who admired grit and a bit of cheekiness, promptly hired him. It was that kind of expedition. The atmosphere was one of profound, almost giddy, optimism. They were adventurers in the truest sense, setting off to conquer the last great terrestrial prize. Their final port of call, the last stop before the true wilderness, was an island in the South Atlantic called South Georgia. And if you're picturing a charming little island village, a sort of quaint seaside community, you might want to adjust your mental image. South Georgia was less a town and more a factory for processing whales. It was a place of work, hard and grimy. The main settlement, Grytviken, was a Norwegian whaling station, and the entire place was saturated with the thick, cloying smell of rendered blubber. Jagged, snow-dusted mountains rose sharply from the sea, and the beaches weren't sand but a dark mixture of rock and coal dust. This wasn't a gentle farewell to civilization. It was a stark, oily industrial outpost clinging to the edge of the world. For the men of the Endurance, it was a month-long pause, a final chance to recalibrate, to send letters home, to feel solid ground under their feet. Even if that ground smelled faintly of boiled cetacean, they trained the dogs, running the teams along the glacial shores, their barks echoing in the thin, cold air. They tested equipment, restocked their coal bunkers, and filled their water tanks from the pure, icy meltwater of the glaciers. It was a period of intense activity, the final preparations before the main event. But there was an undercurrent of unease. Here at the gateway to the Antarctic, they met men who knew the ice. The Norwegian whalers were masters of these waters, seasoned veterans who understood the moods of the Southern Ocean. And the news they gave Shackleton was not good. They spoke of a bad ice year, a severe season. The pack ice, they said, was unusually dense and had extended much farther north than was typical. They'd shake their heads, these tough, weathered men, and look at the stout little Endurance with a certain professional pity. They advised Shackleton to wait, to postpone his departure until conditions improved. It was the kind of sensible, pragmatic advice you get from a local who knows the back roads are flooded. Shackleton, however, was not a man built for waiting. He was fueled by a potent combination of ambition, experience, and a near-mystical belief in his own ability to overcome obstacles. He had been this way before. He knew the risks, and perhaps after all the fundraising, the planning, the public expectation, the thought of delaying was simply impossible. To him, the warnings were not stop signs. They were merely advisories, challenges to be met and overcome. He listened politely, thanked the whalers for their counsel, and gave the order to prepare for departure. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance steamed out of Grytviken's harbour. The whalers gathered on the shore to see them off, a silent, grim-faced audience. It said they didn't wave or cheer. They simply watched as the little wooden ship, with its hopeful crew and its yapping cargo of dogs, turned its bow south and disappeared into the vast grey emptiness. It was the last time the men of the Endurance would see other human beings for almost 2 years. The final slender thread connecting them to the rest of humanity had been cut. From now on, they were entirely on their own. Imagine that feeling. Today, we're never truly alone. Our phones tether us to a global network of information and communication. Even in the most remote places, a satellite can often find you. For them, sailing out of that harbour was like stepping onto another planet. There was no GPS, no satellite phone, no rescue beacon that could summon help in an instant. Worsely, their captain and navigator, had his sextant, his chronometers, and his charts. Their fate rested on his skill, the strength of their ship, and the whims of the most formidable ocean on Earth. They were sailing into a world of white, a void on the map, with only their own courage and ingenuity to rely on. Almost immediately, their journey confirmed the whalers' warnings. Just 2 days out from South Georgia, they encountered the first tendrils of the pack ice. At first, it was almost beautiful. An ice blink, a luminous white glare on the horizon, signaled its presence long before they reached it. Then came the first scattered floes, small, isolated pieces of ice, like giant stark white lily pads floating on the dark water. The ship nudged them aside with ease. The younger men, who had never seen polar ice before, were captivated. They lined the rails, marveling at the strange sculptural beauty of it all. Penguins, startled by the ship's approach, would toboggan on their bellies and dive into the frigid water. Seals, fat and indolent, would lift their heads from an icy sundeck, gaze at the intruders with liquid brown eyes, and then go back to sleep. Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, was in a state of rapture, scrambling up the rigging with his heavy camera to capture the sublime alien landscape. The initial mood was one of exhilaration. This was it. This was the Antarctic. The ship, Endurance, seemed to be living up to its name. She was designed for this. Her hull was made of oak and Norwegian greenheart, one of the densest, strongest woods in the world. Her bow was a thick, solid mass of timber, designed to ride up onto the ice and crush it under the ship's weight. She was a bulldog of a vessel, built for a brawl, and in these early days she seemed to be winning. Shackleton would stand on the bridge, a short, powerful figure, directing Captain Worsley through the growing maze of ice. They'd find a lead, a channel of open water, and push through, the ship's black hull a stark contrast to the brilliant white of the ice. The sounds were new and strange, the sharp crack of a floe splitting apart, the soft percussive thump as a piece of ice bumped along the hull, the constant grinding hiss as they pushed through fields of brash ice, a slushy soup of smaller broken pieces. Life aboard the ship settled into a rigorous yet comfortable routine. This is how humans cope with the extraordinary. We impose the ordinary upon it. The crew was divided into watches, ensuring the ship was manned around the clock. Meals were served with naval punctuality in the wardroom, which they nicknamed the Ritz. It was the social heart of the ship, a space lined with books and a gramophone. In the evenings, after their meal, they would play cards, listen to records, or engage in what they called scientific debates, which were really just wide-ranging arguments about everything under the sun, fueled by intellect and a shared sense of adventure. Each man had his job. The scientists, James the biologist, Clark the geologist, and Wordy the meteorologist, were constantly at work. They deployed nets to collect marine specimens from the deep, strange little creatures that had never seen the sun. They took regular readings of the sea temperature and air pressure. They were cataloguing a world that was to science almost entirely unknown. Every day was a day of discovery. The sailors, the forecastle hands, had their own rhythm. They tended to the ship's engine, mended the sails, which were becoming increasingly ornamental as they relied on steam power to navigate the ice, and performed the 1,000 small tasks required to keep a vessel functioning in extreme conditions. And then there were the dogs, all 69 of them. They lived in kennels on the deck, which the men nicknamed the dogloos. They were a constant, chaotic and vital presence. Their howling was a regular feature of the soundscape, and their care was a major daily chore. Feeding them, cleaning their quarters, and breaking up the occasional fight was a full-time job for the dog handlers, led by the veteran polar explorer Tom Crean. The dogs weren't just animals, they were the expedition's engines, the furry horsepower that was supposed to pull them across the continent. Their health and well-being were paramount. Shackleton presided over it all. He was the boss. His leadership style was intensely personal. He made a point of knowing every man, his strengths, his weaknesses, his temperament. He ate with them, talked with them, and worked alongside them. He understood that in a small, isolated community like this, morale was not a luxury, it was a critical resource, as important as food or coal. He fostered a sense of unity, breaking down the rigid class distinctions that defined Edwardian society back home. On the Endurance, scientists and sailors were expected to muck in together. It was a floating democracy, with Shackleton as its benevolent, watchful president. For weeks, this was their life. A slow, grinding progress south. Some days they would make good headway, finding long, clear leads that allowed them to steam for hours. On other days, the ice would close in, and they would be forced to stop. The ship held motionless in a vast white plain. During these pauses, the men would go out onto the ice. They'd practice with the dog sleds, play impromptu games of football, or go hunting for seals and penguins to supplement their food stores. It still felt like an adventure, a temporary delay. The ship was their safe, warm haven, a little bubble of England adrift in a polar wilderness. Inside there was warmth, hot food and camaraderie. Outside there was a silent, beautiful and utterly indifferent world of ice. But the nature of that ice was changing. As they pushed deeper into the Weddell Sea, the floes became larger, thicker and older. This wasn't the fresh first-year ice they had encountered at the edge of the pack. This was multi-year ice that had survived several summer thaws, growing thicker and harder with each passing winter. It was compacted and pressurized. Its salt leached out, making it as dense as freshwater ice. Trying to push through this was like trying to drive a car through a field of concrete blocks. The reassuring thumps against the hull became jarring, violent collisions. The grinding hiss was replaced by a deep groaning screech of wood against ice that set everyone's teeth on edge. Now, to understand what was happening, we need to talk a little bit about the place they were in. The Weddell Sea is not like other seas. It's notorious among polar explorers for a reason. It is, in essence, a giant, natural ice machine. A huge, slow-moving circular current, known as the Weddell Gyre, dominates the sea. Imagine a vast, lazy whirlpool, hundreds of miles across, that spins clockwise. This current traps the ice. It catches the floes and doesn't let them go. Instead of drifting north into warmer waters and melting, the ice in the Weddell Sea is constantly churned, compacted, and held captive. It's a dead end, a cul-de-sac of frozen water. Shackleton knew this, of course. His plan was to sail south along the coast, in a region he hoped would be a loose area of the pack. But the whalers had been right. It was a bad year. The gyre was choked with an exceptional amount of old, hard ice. The Endurance was no longer a ship navigating through an ice field. It was becoming a particle trapped in a solidifying substance. Worsely, the brilliant navigator, would spend hours in the crow's nest, a small wooden barrel lashed to the top of the mainmast, scanning the horizon for any sign of open water. More often than not, he saw nothing but an endless fractured plain of white stretching in every direction. The leads they found were shorter, more treacherous. Sometimes they would spend a whole day battling to gain a single mile, only to have the ice shift and close the path behind them, erasing all their hard-won progress. It was like trying to walk up a downward-moving escalator made of grinding, shifting ice. The mood on the ship began to subtly shift. The initial exhilaration gave way to a patient, stubborn toil. The football games on the ice became less frequent. The entries in the men's diaries, which had been full of wonder and excitement, now became focused on a single topic: the ice. They recorded the ship's position, the weather, and, most importantly, the state of the pack. Ice all around us. Held up again. Made only 2 miles today. The phrases repeat, a mantra of frustration. Shackleton, ever the optimist, tried to keep spirits high. He organised sing-alongs. He encouraged the men to give lectures on their areas of expertise. Hurley would show his photographs. James would talk about marine biology. But a quiet tension was building. The constant noise of the ice grinding against the ship was a permanent, unnerving soundtrack to their lives. The vibrations ran through the hull, through the soles of their feet, a constant reminder of the immense pressure surrounding them. At night, lying in their bunks, they could hear it, a deep, resonant moaning, punctuated by sudden sharp cracks like pistol shots, as a distant floe fractured under the strain. The ice was no longer a landscape. It was an active, malevolent force. It wasn't just around them. It was acting on them. By mid-January of 1915, they had been in the pack for over a month. They were tantalizingly close to their goal, Varsel Bay, where they planned to make landfall. By Worsley's calculations, it was perhaps only a day's good sailing away. One day, but that one day might as well have been 1,000 miles. They were stuck fast. For days on end, the ship didn't move an inch under its own power. It simply drifted, carried along with the vast frozen sheet of which it was now an unwilling part. The men began to develop a strange, intimate relationship with their captor. They learned its language. They could distinguish the sound of young ice rubbing together from the deep, threatening groan of old, heavy floes colliding. They watched the pressure ridges form, where 2 massive sheets of ice would meet and buckle, piling up into jagged walls of broken ice blocks, some as tall as a house. They saw the raw, unimaginable power of it, a force that could lift a multi-ton slab of ice out of the water and snap it in two as if it were a cracker. And they were living in a wooden ship, right in the middle of it. If you've ever been in a minor traffic accident, you know that jolt of metal on metal. Imagine that feeling, but stretched out over weeks, the pressure constantly building, a slow-motion collision with an entire continent's worth of frozen ocean. The dogs felt the tension too. They grew restless, their howling taking on a more mournful, eerie quality in the profound silence of the frozen sea. The men spent more time with them, finding comfort in their simple, animal companionship. For the younger crew members, the reality of their situation was slowly sinking in. The grand adventure was becoming something else, something more somber and dangerous. They looked to Shackleton for reassurance, and he gave it to them, always maintaining a facade of unshakable confidence. "We'll get a southerly gale soon," he'd say. "That'll break up the pack and open a lead for us." They clung to that hope. They scanned the sky for any sign of a storm, praying for the very weather they had dreaded on the open ocean. On January 18th, a lead of open water appeared nearby. Hope surged through the ship. The engine, which had been silent, was fired up. The stokers shoveled coal, and black smoke once again billowed from the funnel, a stark stain against the pristine white. They tried to force the ship towards the lead, ramming the intervening ice again and again. For 6 hours they battled, the Endurance shuddering with each impact. But the ice was too thick, too unyielding. They couldn't reach it. The lead was a tantalizing glimpse of freedom, a blue road they simply couldn't get to. Defeated, they shut down the engine. The smoke cleared, the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. This was a turning point, a quiet, psychological shift. The belief that they could conquer the ice with force and will was beginning to crack. They were now in a reactive state, waiting for nature to grant them permission to move. The following day, a southerly gale did arrive, but it wasn't the deliverance they had hoped for. Instead of breaking up the pack, the wind and the ocean swell did something far worse. It compressed it. The storm squeezed the vast field of ice floes together, eliminating the small cracks and channels between them. It was like a giant trash compactor, and the Endurance was in the middle of it. The pressure became immense. The ship began to groan in protest. The timbers, thick as a man's waist, began to bend and creak. The men, who had grown used to the everyday sounds of the ice, now heard a new note of agony in the ship's voice. They could feel the hull being squeezed, the pressure pushing inwards from both sides. It was a slow, inexorable clench. They were like a nut in a nutcracker. For several days this continued. No one could sleep properly. They lay in their bunks, listening, waiting for the sound of splintering wood that would signal the end. But the Endurance was strong. She was lifted up by the pressure, rising several feet out of the water as the ice squeezed in beneath her. When the gale finally subsided, the sea around them had changed. It was no longer a fractured mosaic of individual floes. It was a single solid sheet of white, a vast, unbroken plain of ice stretching to the horizon in all directions, with their ship stuck in it like a frozen cherry in a vast white cake. On January 24th, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to shut down the engines to conserve coal. It was a practical decision, but it was also a profound admission of defeat. The ship was no longer a ship, it was a winter station. He gathered the men and told them what they already knew in their hearts. They were frozen in for the winter. They would have to sit and wait, drifting with the ice until the spring thaw might release them. The great trans-Antarctic expedition was, for now, over. The struggle for survival had officially begun. The silence that followed the engine shutting down was absolute. For the first time in months, the thrumming heartbeat of the ship was gone. All that was left was the wind and the occasional terrifying groan of the ice. They were over 800 miles from the nearest human outpost. No one in the outside world knew where they were, or the predicament they were in. They were a tiny speck of life, a handful of men and their dogs, trapped in the immense indifferent heart of the Antarctic. The ship was their home, their shelter, and their prison, held fast in the jaws of the Weddell Sea. And as the long polar night began to descend, all they could do was wait and listen to the ice and wonder if it would ever let them go. Chapter 3. A Prison of Ice. The waiting began, and with it, the listening. You can imagine it, can't you? Lying in your bunk in the near-total darkness. The only light a faint glimmer from a lantern down the passageway. The only real warmth, the press of your own body against the blankets. You try to tell yourself it's just another night at sea, but the sea isn't moving. The ship doesn't rock. It doesn't sway with the familiar rhythm of the waves. Instead, it groans, it creaks and shudders, and occasionally lets out a sharp report like a pistol shot, a sound that makes your heart leap into your throat the first 100 times you hear it. This is the sound of your world, your tiny bubble of civilization being held in a grip of unimaginable pressure. It's the sound of the ice. And it's not just a sound, it's a conversation. It's the constant grinding whisper of an indifferent continent reminding you, moment by moment, that you are not in charge here. You are a guest who has wildly overstayed their welcome, and the host is getting impatient. Ernest Shackleton understood this better than anyone. He knew that the greatest danger wasn't the cold, or the dwindling supplies, or even the colossal pressure of the ice pack. The greatest danger was the human mind left alone with itself in the dark. It was the slow, creeping rot of idleness, the corrosive acid of hopelessness. A man with nothing to do is a man who starts to think too much. He thinks about the miles of ice separating him from home. He thinks about the family he might never see again. He starts listening to the whispers of the ice and begins to believe what it's telling him. Shackleton's first and most critical battle wasn't against Antarctica. It was against the vacuum of time itself, and his primary weapon was routine. He transformed the Endurance from a vessel of exploration into a stationary monastery of relentless, often pointless activity. The ship, locked fast, was now referred to with a kind of grim humour as the Ice Spide. Life aboard was regimented with a precision that would make a drill sergeant nod in appreciation. Mealtimes were sacrosanct, punctual to the minute, serving as the three great pillars upon which the day was built. In between, chores were assigned and carried out with a solemnity that bordered on the religious. The decks were swabbed daily, a truly magnificent act of faith, cleaning a floor that no one was tracking dirt onto from a place they couldn't go. Brass fittings were polished until they gleamed, reflecting the dim lamplight in the long twilight of the descending winter. It was the ultimate fake-it-till-you-make-it strategy, pretending they were a functioning ship on a normal voyage, hoping the universe might eventually get the hint. The scientists, who had come to study a continent they couldn't reach, were now tasked with studying their prison. Reginald James, the physicist, set up his delicate instruments in a makeshift hut on the ice floe, a place they christened the Ritz. There, amidst the groaning ice and biting winds, he conducted experiments with his X-ray spectrometer, performing cutting-edge physics in conditions that were positively prehistoric. Imagine trying to calibrate a sensitive piece of equipment when the entire planet under your feet is groaning and shifting. It's like trying to perform neurosurgery on a roller coaster. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, dutifully took his readings every few hours, day and night, documenting the savage beauty of the weather systems that held them captive. Robert Clark, the biologist, would cut holes in the ice and lower his nets into the freezing dark water below. He'd spend hours dredging the seafloor, pulling up strange, ghostly creatures of the deep, meticulously preserving and cataloguing them. There was a profound, almost poetic absurdity to it all. Here they were, a crew of men facing a very real possibility of annihilation, and they were spending their days carefully counting the legs on a sea spider and noting barometric pressure. But Shackleton knew this wasn't just about collecting data. It was about giving these intelligent, driven men a purpose, a reason to get out of their bunks, a problem to solve that wasn't the terrifyingly unsolvable one of their own predicament. It was a way to keep the mind focused on the small, the manageable, the knowable, while the vast, unknowable horror of their situation loomed just outside the ship's hull. And then there were the dogs. The 69 dogs were not just equipment, they were a living, breathing, barking distraction. They required feeding, training, and constant supervision. Their kennels, built on the ice and nicknamed dogloos, had to be maintained, fights had to be broken up, harnesses had to be mended. The men would take the dog teams out for runs across the vast, flat expanse of their ice floe, not to go anywhere, but simply for the sake of movement. These runs were a brief, exhilarating illusion of freedom. For an hour or two, with the dogs straining in their traces and the sled runners whispering over the snow, they could feel like they were going somewhere, that they were still explorers, masters of their destiny. Then the run would end, and they would return to the static, unmoving silhouette of the Endurance, the only landmark in a world of white. The dogs were also companions, warm bodies in the cold, simple creatures whose needs and affections were a welcome antidote to the crushing complexity of their own fears. But routine and work could only fill the daylight hours, and soon there were no daylight hours to fill. On May 1st, the sun vanished below the horizon, not to be seen again for 4 long months. The world was plunged into a perpetual twilight, which then deepened into an endless star-dusted night. This was the true test. The psychological pressure of the long polar night is something few of us can comprehend. It's not just darkness, it's the removal of the fundamental rhythm of life. Time itself begins to warp and dissolve. Without the sun to mark the passing of days, the world becomes a long, undifferentiated smudge of existence, punctuated only by the clock and the cook's call to meals. Shackleton knew that this was when the real demons would emerge, and so he launched a counter-offensive of determined gaiety. He declared that morale was as vital as food and fuel. The wardroom, the officers' mess, was converted into a communal living space for all 28 men, a decision that broke with the rigid naval class structure of the time. Shackleton understood that in this environment, they were not officers and crew, they were simply survivors, and they would survive together or not at all. This space was christened the Ritz, and it became the social heart of their tiny frozen kingdom. Here, a gramophone would scratch out the popular tunes of 1914, the same songs played over and over and over again, until they were woven into the very fabric of their memory. They held lectures, anyone with a particular skill or knowledge sharing it with the others. Frank Hurley, the photographer, would give slideshows, projecting his stunning glass plate images onto a sheet hung up in the Ritz. For a few moments, the men could see the world they had left behind, or the stunning, terrible beauty of the world they were now in, captured and made safe by Hurley's lens. They could almost forget the groaning of the ice just a few feet away. They celebrated birthdays with absurd formality, inventing ridiculous toasts and saving a bit of sugar for a special dessert. They held mock elections and wrote and performed elaborate, comically amateurish plays and musical reviews. They cobbled together costumes from blankets and burlap sacks, men dressing up as outrageous caricatures of women, singing off-key songs they'd written themselves. It was the Antarctic vaudeville circuit, a single-venue tour with a captive audience. From our modern perspective, it seems almost childish, but it was an act of profound psychological warfare. Laughter was a weapon. It was a way of shouting back at the crushing, silent indifference of the ice. It was a declaration that even here, at the end of the world, in the cold and the dark, they were still human. They could still find joy, however absurd. And through it all, there was the banjo. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, had brought along his 5-string banjo, an instrument that seems comically out of place in the epic landscape of the Antarctic. Yet Shackleton would later state that this banjo was vital mental medicine. In the evenings, in the warm, smoky confines of the Ritz, Hussey would play. He'd play jaunty tunes, folk songs, anything that was upbeat and familiar, and the men would sing along, their voices filling the small space, a tiny bubble of warmth and sound against the infinite, frozen silence outside. That banjo, light and cheerful and utterly frivolous, was perhaps the most important piece of survival equipment on the entire ship. It was a bulwark against the darkness, a reminder of a world of pubs and parties and summer evenings, a world they desperately hoped to see again. They even took their games outside. On the rare days when the wind dropped and the temperature climbed to a balmy -20 degrees, they would play football on the ice. Imagine that scene, 28 men in heavy wool and furs, slipping and sliding on an uneven field of sea ice, kicking a makeshift ball, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The goals were marked with blocks of snow. The dogs would run alongside, barking in a frenzy, occasionally stealing the ball and running off with it. It was utterly, gloriously ridiculous. But for an afternoon, they weren't trapped men, they were just men playing a game. This was Shackleton's genius. He didn't just command his men, he managed their souls. He was constantly vigilant, watching for any sign of despair. He knew each man's temperament, his strengths, his breaking points. If he saw a man brooding alone, he would find a reason to strike up a conversation, to give him a special task, to draw him back into the fold. He understood that hope was not a passive emotion. It was an active discipline. It had to be practiced, cultivated, and protected at all costs. But no amount of routine or forced cheerfulness could completely erase the reality of their situation. The ice was a living entity, and it was not a benevolent one. The sounds it made became a language the men learned to interpret. There was the low, constant grinding, the bass note of their existence. There were the sharp cracks like rifle shots as a fissure opened somewhere nearby. And then there was the pressure, a slow, rising groan that would build and build until the entire ship would shudder, its timbers screaming in protest. During these pressure waves, the men would stop what they were doing, all conversation ceasing, every man listening, wondering if this would be the time the hull finally gave way. They would look at each other, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns, and in their eyes you would see the raw, unspoken fear. They could feel the pressure through the soles of their boots. The ice floe they were camped on would visibly bow and buckle. Sometimes 2 massive plates of ice would collide nearby, pushing up enormous ridges of broken ice with a sound like a slow-motion train crash. It was a constant, visceral reminder of the power that held them. They were living on the back of a beast, and they could feel its muscles tensing beneath them. The anxiety was a constant companion. They were drifting, but not towards safety. The relentless current of the Weddell Sea was carrying them northwest, further and further away from any possible land they might have been able to reach. Every observation of their position confirmed it. They were being taken deeper into the labyrinth. They had no control. They were passengers on a raft of ice, their fate entirely in the hands of the currents and the whims of the pack. The ship, once a symbol of their mastery over the elements, was now as helpless as a twig in a flood. Months passed in this strange twilight existence. June, July, August. The darkness was absolute. The cold was a physical presence, seeping into the ship, coating the walls with a thick layer of rime ice. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. The men's beards would freeze solid with their own breath the moment they stepped outside, but they endured. They held on to the routine. They listened to the banjo. They laughed at their own terrible jokes. They had survived the winter, the long, dark test of their spirit. And then, in late August, a faint glow appeared on the northern horizon. The sun was returning. Hope, real and palpable, surged through the ship. Perhaps the spring thaw would come. Perhaps the ice would loosen its grip, and they would be free. The light grew stronger each day, and with it their optimism. They began to make plans, to talk of the future, of the journey home. But the spring brought a different kind of change. The returning warmth didn't just mean light, it meant movement. The vast solid ice pack began to break up, not into open water, but into smaller, more violent flows. The pressure on the Endurance intensified beyond anything they had yet experienced. The gentle groans of winter became the agonized shrieks of spring. The ice was no longer just a prison, it was becoming an executioner. The beast that had held them captive was now beginning to squeeze. The men would stand on the deck and watch, horrified, as massive blocks of ice, tons upon tons of them, were pushed up against the ship's hull, lifting it, twisting it, playing with it like a child's toy. The sounds were no longer just whispers and groans, they were the sounds of a world being torn apart, and their ship was at the very centre of it. The time for waiting was over, the ice was about to deliver its verdict. Chapter 4. The Death of the Endurance. And the verdict, when it came, was swift and without mercy. The period of gentle, almost playful nudging was over. The game had ended. October 24th, 1915, was the day the ice pack decided to stop toying with its captive and begin the kill. It happened with a sudden violent shudder that threw men to the deck. The pressure, which had been a constant dull ache for months, intensified into an all-out assault. The ship, which had been their fortress, their home, their tiny, self-contained universe, began to scream. It's a sound that's almost impossible for us to imagine. We know the sounds of our own homes, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a floorboard upstairs that you've come to recognize. You know that feeling when a strange, unfamiliar noise in the dead of night jolts you awake, your mind racing to identify the source. Now, imagine that sound is the groan of every single piece of wood that separates you from a world of absolute death. Imagine that sound is amplified 1,000 times, a symphony of destruction played by an orchestra of ice. The men described it in their diaries with a kind of stunned horror. They called it a shriek, a roar, the sound of a giant beast in its death throes. The timbers, those massive lengths of Norwegian fir and English oak, 2.5 feet thick in places, began to protest. At first it was a deep, resonant groaning, the kind of sound a very old tree might make in a gale-force wind. But soon that groaning escalated into sharp, cracking reports that sounded like rifle shots or artillery fire. These weren't gentle creaks. They were the sounds of the ship's very bones breaking. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, and a man not given to poetic exaggeration, wrote that the ship was being hove upwards and outwards as if it were a toy. Imagine that. Their vessel, a 144-foot barkentine built to withstand the worst the polar regions could throw at it, was being lifted clean out of the water by the sheer, unimaginable force of the ice. The pressure was coming from both sides, a colossal vice closing with geological slowness and unstoppable power. The port side was being crushed, while the starboard side was being simultaneously lifted. The whole ship was being twisted, torqued along its length like a wet towel being wrung out. Below decks, the scene was one of barely contained chaos. The hold, which had been a place of orderly storage, became a madhouse of splintering wood and cascading supplies. Beams were bowing inwards, their ends pulling free from their fixtures. The noise was deafening, a constant grinding, explosive racket that made it impossible to think, let alone sleep. and through it all, there was a new sound, the most terrifying of all, the trickle, and then the gush of water. The ice had found a way in. A seam near the stern had been sprung. The ship's stern post, the massive vertical timber at the very back of the ship, was being twisted from the keel. It was a mortal wound. The pumps were manned immediately. For hours, in the freezing, noisy darkness of the lower decks, the men worked in shifts, a desperate rhythmic clanging against the cacophony of the ship's destruction. It was a fight they knew, in their hearts, they could not win. It was like trying to bail out a sinking bathtub with a thimble while the taps are still running full blast. The water, black and lethally cold, gained on them inch by inch. Up on deck, the scene was surreal. The deck itself, which for over a year had been their solid, predictable ground, was no longer flat. The pressure from the sides was forcing the floorboards to buckle upwards, creating what one man called a small hill amidships. To walk from one end of the ship to the other was to climb a gentle slope, and then descend. Masts that had stood ramrod straight for years were now whipping back and forth as the ship convulsed beneath them, stays and shrouds. The thick wire rigging that held everything in place would slacken and then snap taut with a sound like a monstrous guitar string breaking, vibrating through the whole frame of the ship. Shackleton watched it all with a face of grim composure. This was the moment he had dreaded, the scenario that had played out in his darkest thoughts for months. But now that it was here, his calm was absolute. He moved about the ship, observing the damage, speaking to the men in a low, even voice. He ordered the lifeboats to be provisioned and swung out over the side, ready for a quick departure. He directed the sledges to be loaded with essential supplies. There was no panic, no shouting, just the quiet, efficient execution of a contingency plan that everyone had hoped they would never have to use. The discipline that had been drilled into them, the routine and order of the past year, was now paying its dividend. They were not panicking sailors, they were a unit, following the orders of their leader. For 3 days, they fought, they pumped, they tried to shore up the buckling timbers. Worsley, in a fit of desperate energy, took an axe and went over the side, hacking at the pressure ridge that was doing the most damage. A single man with a hand tool trying to fight a continental ice sheet. It was a futile, heroic, and utterly human gesture. He was chipping away at a mountain, and the mountain was pushing back. The end came on October 27th. The pressure reached a new, terrifying crescendo. A massive floe, a slab of ice the size of a city block, rammed into the port side with a force that felt like an earthquake. The men below decks were thrown from the pumps. There was a final, agonizing shriek of wood and metal, a sound that seemed to go on forever, and then a lurch. The stern post was torn away. The back of the ship was broken. Water no longer seeped in. It flooded. Shackleton came on deck. He took one look at the angle of the stern, at the water pouring over the broken planking, and he knew the fight was over. He gathered the men on the buckling deck of their dying home. He looked at their tired, frost-rimmed faces, illuminated by the cold, perpetual twilight, and in a voice that was clear and steady, he said the words they all knew were coming. "She's going, boys. I think it's time to go." There was no great cry of despair, just a quiet, sombre acceptance. The Endurance had endured all she could. She had been their shield, their warmth, their connection to everything they knew. Now she was just a wreck, a tomb. The order was given, abandon ship. What followed was not the frantic, pell-mell chaos of a typical shipwreck. It was a strange, almost methodical exodus. This was the most stressful, the most consequential moving day in human history. The home was being demolished around them, and they had to pack. They had to decide, in a matter of hours, what constituted life itself. The 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancombe Wills, were their arks. They were everything. They were lowered carefully onto the uneven, treacherous surface of the ice floe beside the ship. Then came the sledges. These would be their moving vans across the frozen ocean. On them went the barest essentials, food, first and foremost. Sledging rations, pemmican, biscuits. Cases of it were hauled from the ruined hold and stacked. Then came the fuel, paraffin, for the precious primer stoves, which would be their only means of melting snow for water and cooking food. Without the stoves they would die of thirst in a world made of water. Then came the gear, sleeping bags, made of reindeer hide, heavy and vital, tents, a few changes of clothes, mostly socks, navigation equipment. Worsley's chronometers and sextant were treated with the reverence of holy relics, and of course the firearms, rifles and shotguns, not for defense but for hunting seals and penguins. their future food supply. The triage of their possessions was brutal and heartbreaking. Everything that represented their old lives, their comfort, their civilization, had to be left behind. Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, faced an agonizing choice. His life's work, the documentation of their entire journey, was trapped on the ship in the form of 500 fragile, heavy glass plate negatives. With Shackleton, he went back into the watery, treacherous wreck. They submerged their arms into the icy slush of the hold and retrieved the box, but they couldn't take them all. The weight was too much. So there, on the ice, the two men sat and went through them one by one. They chose the 150 best plates, the ones that told the story most completely. And then, with a heavy heart, Hurley smashed the other 350 plates on the ice, so he wouldn't be tempted to go back for them. It was an act of profound sacrifice, choosing the survival of the crew over the preservation of his own art. Shackleton, too, had to make a symbolic gesture. He had brought with him a Bible, a gift from Queen Alexandra, inscribed with her own hand. He knew they couldn't carry its weight. He ripped out the flyleaf with the Queen's inscription, and a single page from the Book of Job, the passage that reads, "Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it." He placed those folded pages in his pocket, and left the rest of the book on the deck of the sinking ship. He then took his gold watch and a handful of sovereigns, and threw them into the snow. "We don't need these," he said. Wealth had become meaningless. Their currency was now food, fuel, and the strength in their arms. He made one more, deeply personal sacrifice. He ordered that his own personal banjo, which had been a source of much-needed cheerfulness, be brought out. He held it for a moment, and then smashed it on the ice. The message was clear. The time for light-hearted entertainment was over. This was a new reality. The dogs, all 69 of them, were led off the ship, whining and confused. They were not pets. They were engines, vital for pulling the sledges across the ice. The puppies born during the winter were carried off in the arms of the men who had raised them. They made their first camp on the very slab of ice that was crushing their ship. They called it Ocean Camp. A more ironic name is hard to imagine. It was a chaotic jumble of tents, crates, sledges, and confused dogs, all huddled in the shadow of the Endurance. The wreck was still there, groaning and shifting, her masts askew, her hull ripped open. It was like camping in your own front yard while you watch your house slowly and violently collapse. The first night on the ice was a profound psychological shock. For over a year they had slept in bunks, in a relatively warm, dry space protected by layers of wood. Now their beds were reindeer hide bags laid directly on the snow. The cold was no longer something outside the walls. It was a physical presence seeping up from below, trying to steal the heat from their very bones. The wind, which had whistled harmlessly in the ship's rigging, now tore at the thin canvas of their tents, and the sounds continued. The Endurance did not die quickly. She lingered. For weeks she remained trapped in the ice, a constant tortured reminder of their failure and their loss. The men at Ocean Camp had to watch and listen to her final agony. They would wake in the night to a deafening crack as one of her masts finally gave way and crashed to the deck. They would see her bow section crushed inwards, her beautiful lines warped into a caricature of a ship. It was a slow-motion demolition, a daily torment. Each day they would make perilous trips back to the wreck, now leaning at a precarious 30-degree angle, to salvage anything they could. They created a sort of flying fox to haul more food and timber across the treacherous shifting ice between the camp and the ship. The timber was vital. They could use it to build shelters, or as fuel. They were quite literally dismantling their old home to build their new, pathetic one. Hurley went back again and again, a man obsessed, risking his life to retrieve his cumbersome camera and tripod, to document the ship's final days. The images he took are some of the most haunting in the history of exploration. The Endurance, her stern rising, her bows crushed, looking like a stricken whale, surrounded by a chaotic sea of jagged ice blocks. They are the photographs of a funeral. The final end came on November 21st, nearly a month after they had abandoned her. The ice, as if bored with its game, finally relaxed its grip for a moment. The pressure eased, and the mangled hull of the Endurance, now filled with ice and water, began to sink. The men all gathered on a small rise in the ice floe to watch. Quietly, without ceremony, she went down. The stern, which had been lifted high, was the last to go. It rose one final time, as if in a last desperate gasp for air, and then slid beneath the surface of the churning ice. For a few moments the tips of her masts were visible above the floe, and then they too were gone. The ice, the great white indifferent beast, closed over the spot where she had been. The grinding and groaning of the ship, the soundtrack to their lives for the past month, was replaced by a profound and terrible silence. There was nothing, just the whisper of the wind across the endless ice. The men stood there for a long time, hats off, not speaking. They were watching their last link to the world, to civilization, to home, disappear forever. They were no longer the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. They were 28 men and a pack of dogs, marooned on a floating piece of ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with no ship, no radio, and no hope of rescue. Their home was gone. Their journey had just begun. Chapter 5. Life on the Floe. And so their new life began. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, crunching sound of 28 pairs of boots on snow, turning away from the grave of their ship to face their new and profoundly absurd reality. Their home was now a slab of frozen salt water, drifting aimlessly in the Weddell Sea. It was the ultimate, high-stakes, planet-sized version of the floor is lava, except the floor was also constantly trying to break apart and swallow you whole. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, knew that the first enemy to conquer wasn't the cold, or the hunger, or the crushing despair. It was chaos. An idle mind in this environment was a dangerous thing. It would start to dwell on the impossibilities, on the sheer cosmic bad luck of it all. So he gave them a job, the most human job of all. He told them to build a home. They called their first settlement Ocean Camp, a name that was both beautifully simple and deeply unsettling. It wasn't a camp near the ocean, it was a camp on the ocean. The men salvaged what they could from the dying Endurance in those final days. It was a frantic, desperate scramble, like looting a condemned building before the wrecking ball hits. They pulled out everything that wasn't nailed down, and a few things that were: sledges, timber, sails, scientific equipment, and most importantly, the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. These were no longer mere boats. They were their last-ditch lottery tickets, their only tangible connection to a future that didn't involve becoming a permanent feature of the Antarctic landscape. The camp itself was a small, fragile circle of humanity against a backdrop of infinite, indifferent white. They erected the 5 canvas tents, their thin walls the only thing separating them from a cold that didn't just bite, it gnawed. Inside, the world was a cramped, damp, semi-darkness. Condensation from their breath would freeze on the inside of the canvas, forming a delicate layer of frost that would shower down on them with every gust of wind. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. The centerpiece of Ocean Camp, the hub of their new micro-civilization, was the galley. Frank Hurley, the photographer, and a few others cobbled it together from salvaged ship's timber and sailcloth. It was a smoky, greasy, magnificent hovel. Here, Charles Green, the cook, presided over his domain with a stoicism that bordered on heroic. His stove was an improvised marvel, built from an old ash chute and a salvaged ship's tank, fueled by seal blubber. Let's just pause and consider the smell. We have 28 men who haven't had a proper wash in a year, sleeping in damp reindeer hide bags, huddled around a stove burning rendered animal fat. The air would have been thick with the aromas of old smoke, unwashed bodies, wet wool, and cooking seal. It was a smell that would cling to everything, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Yet, that galley was the heart of the camp. It was warmth, it was light, it was the promise of a hot meal, a mug of tea, and a brief respite from the wind that howled outside like an angry ghost. It was their medieval hearth, their town square, their television. Shackleton knew that routine was the scaffolding that would keep their minds from collapsing. He established a strict, unyielding schedule: wake up, breakfast, duties, lunch, more duties, dinner, and then the long, dark night. Duties were varied. Some men were assigned to hunting parties, scanning the horizon for the dark shapes of seals or the comical upright figures of penguins. Others were tasked with maintaining the camp, shoveling snow, or looking after the dogs, who had their own chaotic settlement, nicknamed Dogtown. The dogs were a living, barking, whining link to their old life, to the expedition's original grand purpose. They were also a source of comfort, of conflict, and of a heart-breakingly difficult decision to come. For now, they were companions. Their warm bodies a welcome comfort in the cold, their squabbles a distraction from the men's own simmering tensions. And then there was the food, the new currency of their world. Their pantry was a chaotic jumble sale of salvaged goods, sacks of flour, tins of sugar, blocks of pemmican, that brick-like concoction of dried meat, fat and despair that was the staple of polar explorers. But these supplies were finite. A simple mathematical equation with a terrifying answer. To survive, they had to live off the land, or, more accurately, off the sea and the ice that floated upon it. Their salvation came in two forms, the Weddell seal and the Adelie penguin. The seals were lazy, blubbery beasts, often found snoozing near leads of open water. They were easy targets, which was a mercy. The men had little energy to spare for a challenging hunt. A single seal provided a bounty, fresh meat, which fought off the dreaded scurvy, a thick layer of blubber for the cook stove which kept them from freezing, and an oil that could be used in their makeshift lamps. It was their supermarket, their gas station and their power plant, all rolled into one sleek, whiskered package. The penguins were a different story. They were the court jesters of this frozen kingdom, inquisitive, fearless and utterly charming. They would waddle right into camp, heads cocked, observing the strange two-legged invaders with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Their upright, gentlemanly posture made hunting them feel, as some men noted in their diaries, a bit like murder. But necessity is a brutal master. A penguin provided a few pounds of dark, oily meat, and so the gentleman of the Antarctic became a regular feature on the menu. The meals themselves, presided over by Green, were a monotonous, greasy affair called hoosh. Hoosh was less a recipe and more a concept. It was whatever meat was available, seal, penguin, or a bit of both, stewed with some pemmican and maybe a biscuit crumbled in for texture. Sometimes, on a truly decadent day, a little bit of salvaged flour would be used to thicken it. It was served hot and eaten quickly. The men hunched over their bowls, savouring the warmth as much as the sustenance. This was not fine dining. This was fuel. This was the difference between waking up the next morning and not. Shackleton understood the psychology of food better than anyone. He put the cook, Green, in charge of rationing, and made sure every single man, including himself, received the exact same portion. There were no special privileges for the boss. When a fresh seal was brought in, the organ meat, the liver and the heart, rich in vitamins, was a prized delicacy. It was divided with mathematical precision. This simple act of fairness was a powerful message. We are all in this together. Our survival is collective. But while the men focused on the daily grind of hunting, cooking and surviving, Shackleton was focused on their real enemy, the ice itself. Their frozen raft was not a stable platform. It was a living, breathing entity, a fickle landlord who could decide to evict them at any moment. The Weddell Sea is a relentless churn of ice, driven by currents and winds. Their flow was in constant motion, drifting north, sometimes spinning in slow, lazy circles. And it was noisy. The silence of the Antarctic is a myth. The ice groaned and creaked like the timbers of an old ship. Pressure ridges would form as two floes collided, throwing up massive jagged walls of blue ice with a sound like grinding thunder. And then there was the most terrifying sound of all, a sharp, sudden crack, like a pistol shot, that meant a new lead of open water had just split their world in two. Every time that sound echoed across the camp, hearts would stop. Men would scramble from their tents, their eyes wide with fear, scanning the ice around them. Had it split under the galley, through Dogtown, under their own tent? On several occasions it did. A crack would appear right through the middle of camp, and they would have to scramble to move their precious supplies and tents to the larger, safer side of the floe. They were living on a giant, slowly disintegrating jigsaw puzzle, and they had no idea what the final picture was supposed to look like. This constant underlying tension was a corrosive acid on morale. Shackleton became a master of psychological warfare. He was part CEO, part kindergarten teacher, part therapist. He knew every man's name, his temperament, his weaknesses. He made it his business to speak to everyone, every single day. He would move from tent to tent, sharing a joke with one man, listening to another's anxieties, quietly assessing the mood of his crew. He understood the importance of fending off the mental darkness that was as dangerous as the physical cold. He encouraged singing. The bleak evenings were filled with off-key sea shanties and popular songs from home, the sound swallowed up by the immense emptiness around them. He organized celebrations for any reason he could find. Midwinter's Day was a grand feast. Birthdays were marked with an extra biscuit or a spoonful of sugar in one's tea. Unimaginable luxuries. Frank Hurley, the photographer, played a crucial role. Before the Endurance went down, he had dived into the icy, slush-filled interior of the ship to rescue his photographic plates. Shackleton had made him choose. He could only save what he could carry. They sat on the ice together, looking through the hundreds of glass negatives, and selected the best 150. The rest, a chronicle of their journey, were left to sink with the ship. It was a brutal act of triage, but those 150 images were a treasure. On some evenings, Hurley would rig up a makeshift projector, and the men would huddle together to watch a slideshow of their own doomed voyage, a surreal form of home movie in the middle of nowhere. It was a reminder of who they were, of the world they had left behind, and strangely, it gave them strength. But even the best leadership couldn't erase the fundamental horror of their situation. Tensions simmered. Men who had been shipmates were now roommates in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Annoying habits became magnified. The way a man snored, the way he chewed his hoosh, the unending pessimism of another. These little things could fester into outright hatred. The most serious test of Shackleton's authority came from Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter, a tough, skilled and cynical Scotsman. When Shackleton ordered the men to start hauling the lifeboats over the treacherous broken ice, McNish, whose cat had been shot as the supplies dwindled, finally broke. He declared that since the ship had sunk, the articles of service were void. He was no longer under orders. It was a mutiny, plain and simple, a challenge to the very foundation of their survival. Shackleton didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He walked over to McNish, pulled out a copy of the ship's articles from his pocket, which he had astoundingly thought to save, and read the relevant passage aloud. It stated that the crew was under the captain's command until they were returned to a safe port. Then he looked at McNish and spoke to him quietly, but with a steel in his voice that left no room for argument. He explained that any man who refused an order would be shot. The mutiny ended as quickly as it had begun. McNish went back to work. The chain of command held, but it was a stark reminder of how close to the edge they all were. As the weeks turned into months, their world began to change. The endless sun of the Antarctic summer began to dip below the horizon for longer and longer each day, and their ice floe, their home, was dying. The drift was carrying them north, into warmer waters. The floe, once a vast expanse of thick, solid ice, was now honeycombed with leads and pools of meltwater. It was rotting from below. The day came when Ocean Camp was no longer tenable. A huge crack split their floe, and Shackleton gave the order to move. What followed was a week of hell. They had to haul the 3 heavy lifeboats and all their supplies across a landscape of shifting, breaking ice and deep, slushy snow. It was back-breaking, soul-destroying work. They would hack a road through the pressure ridges, manhandle the boats over, and then have to do it all over again 100 yards later. They made agonizingly slow progress, sometimes less than a mile a day. Eventually, they found a larger, seemingly more stable floe. They were exhausted, soaked, and demoralized. They set up a new camp. Shackleton, with his unerring instinct for psychology, gave it a name that was both a description and a command: Patience Camp. And there, they waited. Patience was all they had left. The hunting grew poorer. The seals became scarce. The penguins disappeared. They had to start eating the dogs. This was one of the hardest blows of all. The men who had been tasked with caring for the dogs now had to lead them away to be shot. Wild. The meteorologist was the designated executioner, a grim duty he carried out with efficiency but no pleasure. The men understood the necessity. The dogs consumed precious seal meat that the men now needed, but understanding didn't make the quiet gunshots any easier to hear. Life at Patience Camp was bleaker than before. The ice was thinner, the open water closer, the weather grew stormier. A constant miserable dampness permeated everything. Their reindeer hide sleeping bags, their only source of comfort, became waterlogged and frozen stiff. Getting into them at night was, as one man wrote, like getting into a suit of armor. They could now hear a new sound, a constant low roar on the horizon. It was the sound of the open ocean. Their raft was disintegrating. Shackleton knew the time for patience was running out. Every day he would climb to the highest point of the floe, a mound of ice they called the Crow's Nest, and scan the horizon with his binoculars. He was watching the ice, calculating the drift, waiting for the exact right moment. To leave too early would be to enter a sea still choked with dangerous ice. To leave too late would be to have their floe break up from under them, losing the boats and all hope. The weight of this decision rested on him alone. 27 other lives depended on his judgment. He kept his own counsel, projecting an air of unwavering confidence he could not possibly have felt. He appeared calm, resolute, even cheerful, but in the privacy of his diary, he confessed his anxieties, his fears for his men. Then, on April 8, 1916, nearly 5 months after they first set up camp, the the moment arrived. The great floe they were on suddenly split with a violent crack that ran directly beneath their camp. The two halves began to shear apart. This was it, the final eviction notice. Shackleton's voice cut through the chaos. Launch the boats. There was no time for deliberation, no time for fear. The training, the routine, the discipline of the past 5 months took over. The men worked with a frantic, desperate energy. They loaded the sledges, harnessed themselves like dogs, and began the final, mad dash to the edge of their disintegrating island. The ice was moving beneath their feet. They were loading their worldly possessions, a few tins of pemmican, their frozen sleeping bags, and themselves into 3 small, open wooden boats. After 165 days of a strange, static kind of survival, of waiting and enduring, they were finally leaving the ice. They were abandoning the relative safety of their solid, if unreliable, world for the violent uncertainty of the Southern Ocean. Their long, frozen nightmare was over. A new and perhaps even more terrifying journey was about to begin. They were no longer castaways. They were sailors again. Sailors with no ship, adrift in the most dangerous sea on Earth. Chapter 6. The Boat Journey to Desolation. They were sailors again. Sailors with no ship, adrift in the most dangerous sea on Earth. The moment the small wooden hulls of the James Caird, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills slid off the edge of their disintegrating ice floe, the world changed. For 165 days, their universe had been a flat, white, relatively stable plain. It was a prison, to be sure, but a solid one. You could walk on it, you could build a shelter on it. Now their entire world was 3 slivers of wood, each barely 20 feet long, tossed about in a churning, grinding chaos of water and ice. Shackleton, in the lead boat, the James Caird, felt the transition in his bones. The solid, predictable ground beneath his feet was gone, replaced by a violent, unpredictable lurching. He looked back at the other 2 boats, rising and falling on the grey swell, their crews little more than dark, huddled shapes against the glare of the ice. Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator, was at the tiller of the Dudley Docker. In the 3rd boat, the Stancomb Wills, was a collection of the hardiest seamen, including Tom Crean. The 28 men of the Endurance were now divided into 3 tiny, vulnerable tribes, their only connection the shared patch of frigid water between them and the sight of Shackleton's hand raised in a signal. Their immediate goal wasn't even the open ocean, it was escape. They were in what sailors call brash ice, a treacherous soup of ice chunks, ranging from the size of a car to the size of a small house, all grinding against each other. It was a labyrinth with moving walls, and those walls could crush a wooden boat as easily as you might crush an eggshell in your fist. The sound was immense, a constant deep groaning and cracking, as if the planet itself was complaining. Progress was agonizingly slow. The men had to use their oars not for rowing, but for pushing. They would shove against a 10-ton slab of ice to pivot the boat, then paddle furiously through a newly opened channel of water, only to find it closing up ahead of them. It was a full-body workout from hell, the kind of physical exertion that leaves you breathless and aching in minutes, but they had to sustain it for hours. Their hands, already raw from months of camp life, were now gripping wet, icy oars, pushing against the immense inertia of the polar pack. Every man was soaked within the first hour. The spray from the ocean, which was only a few degrees above freezing, was constant. A wave would slap against the side of the boat, sending a sheet of liquid ice over the men huddled inside. There was no foul-weather gear in 1916 that could stand up to this. The water seeped through their wool and canvas, chilling them to the core. Forget your modern waterproof jacket with its breathable membrane. Their gear acted more like a sponge, soaking up the Antarctic and holding it right against their skin. As the first day wore on, a new, more insidious enemy made its presence felt: thirst. It is one of the universe's crueler ironies to be dying of thirst while surrounded by millions of square miles of water. The salt water of the Weddell Sea was, of course, completely undrinkable. They could, in theory, melt the freshwater ice from the floes around them, but that required stopping, climbing onto a piece of ice, chipping away at it, and using their precious Primus stove and fuel to melt it. In this moving maze, stopping was not an option. Stopping meant getting trapped, or worse, crushed. So they pushed on, their throats growing drier, their lips starting to crack in the cold, salty air. The men would look at the water all around them, this endless supply of liquid they couldn't have, and it became a kind of psychological torture. They had water rations, of course, but these were pitifully small, measured out to last for a journey of unknown length. Shackleton knew that dehydration was as great a threat as the ice. It would sap their strength, cloud their judgment, and bring on a swift, quiet death. The men tried chewing on small pieces of frozen seal meat from their stores, not for the calories, but for the few drops of moisture they could press from the frozen flesh. Imagine being so thirsty that you're gnawing on a frozen steak, not to eat it, but just to wet your tongue. When the brief Antarctic twilight began to fall, they had made perhaps 2 miles. 2 miles, a distance you could walk in half an hour on a city street. It had taken them an entire day of back-breaking, spirit-crushing labour. There was no real night, just a dimming of the light, a greying of the world. They had to find a place to rest. They spotted a large, thick ice floe, what sailors called a floeberg, that seemed stable enough. With immense effort, they hauled the 3 boats up onto its surface, a task that left them utterly spent. And now came the ritual of making camp. It was a pathetic imitation of their life on Patience Camp. The men were too exhausted to even attempt to put up the tents. They simply tipped the boats on their sides to act as a meagre windbreak. The primus stove was lit, a sputtering, brave little flame in the vast, cold emptiness. The cook, Charles Green, began the long process of making a hot drink. This wasn't a matter of flicking a switch on a kettle. He had to chip ice, melt it slowly over the tiny flame, and then brew a weak, sugary tea. This hoosh, as they called it, was the highlight of their day. It was warmth, it was hydration, it was life. The men huddled around the stove, cupping the hot metal mugs in their frozen hands, the steam warming their faces. It was a small circle of humanity in an infinite wilderness of ice. Sleep, however, was a different matter. Their sleeping bags, made of reindeer hide, were a marvel of their time. But they had one critical design flaw. When they got wet, they stayed wet, and every man's bag was soaked through. When the men crawled into them, the wet fur and leather began to freeze from their own body heat, evaporating into the sub-zero air. The bags became stiff, icy shells. It wasn't like climbing into a cold bed. It was like trying to sleep inside a poorly designed freezer. The men would shiver uncontrollably, their teeth chattering, a deep bone-aching cold that no amount of huddling could fix. They would drift off into a state that wasn't quite sleep, a sort of semi-conscious delirium, only to be jolted awake by the violent shivering or the pain in their extremities. This is when the frostbite really began its silent, insidious work. Frostbite doesn't announce itself with a bang. It creeps in. A man might notice his toes felt a bit numb, then strangely warm, then nothing at all. He might look at his fingers and see the tips have turned a waxy dead white. Some men suffered terribly. Blackborrow, the young stowaway, had his feet so badly frozen they looked like lumps of black coal. The pain, they said, was excruciating. A burning, stabbing agony that would then terrifyingly fade to nothing as the nerves died. Shackleton himself barely slept. He would patrol the small camp, checking on his men, whispering a word of encouragement here, adjusting a frozen sleeping bag there. He knew that their survival depended entirely on morale. If despair set in, they were finished. He was their central heating system, fueled by his own indomitable will. He projected an aura of calm competence, as if this were all just a slightly more difficult than expected camping trip. He never let them see his own fears, his own deep-seated exhaustion. The next day was a repeat of the first. Push, paddle, shove. The ice seemed to be conspiring against them, the channels closing just as they approached. It was a slow, brutal slog, and all the while, the thirst grew worse. The sun, when it appeared, was a malevolent force. It shone with a brilliant, cold light, glaring off the endless white, causing snow blindness. The men's eyes became red-rimmed and swollen, a constant gritty pain. They wore makeshift goggles, but the glare was relentless. It was a landscape designed to punish the senses. On the third day, the sea began to change. A long, oily swell started to roll in from the north, a sign that the open ocean was near. The ice pack, which had been tightly packed, began to break up and spread out. At first, this was a relief. The channels widened. They could finally row properly, putting their backs into it. But the relief was short-lived. As the ice dispersed, the boats were exposed to the full force of the waves. These weren't the waves you see at a beach. These were the legendary waves of the Southern Ocean, the greybeards that circumnavigate the globe with nothing to stop them. They were huge, rolling mountains of water, deep grey and menacing. The 3 small boats, which had seemed so crowded and substantial on the ice, now looked like toys. They would climb the face of a massive wave, teetering on its crest for a heart-stopping moment, with a view of a terrifying, chaotic seascape, before plunging down into the trough, the next wave already looming over them like a collapsing building. Seasickness, which had been a non-issue in the calm waters of the ice pack, now became a universal misery. Men who had spent their lives at sea were suddenly violently ill. In an open, overcrowded boat, in freezing temperatures, there is nowhere to go, there is no privacy, no comfort. The men were sick where they sat, adding to the filth and misery in the bottom of the boat. The combination of seasickness, dehydration and extreme cold was a brutal assault on the human body. The spray was now constant and freezing. Everything was coated in a layer of ice. The ropes were stiff as iron bars, painful to handle with frostbitten fingers. The men's beards and eyebrows became caked with frozen saltwater spray. They looked like grotesque ice statues of their former selves. The little primus stove was almost impossible to use on the lurching boats. For a full 2 days they had no hot food or drink at all. They subsisted on cold rations, hard biscuits and frozen pemmican, which they had to force down their parched throats. And through all of this, Frank Worsley had to navigate. Think about what that means. Today, we cross an ocean with GPS that tells us our position to within a few feet. Worsley had a sextant, a chronometer, and some paper charts. To get a sight to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon, he needed to see the sun and the horizon at the same time. In the stormy, overcast Weddell Sea, this was a rare event. But even when the sun did break through the clouds, the task was nearly impossible. He was in a tiny boat being thrown 30 feet up and then 30 feet down. The horizon would appear and disappear. He had to stand, bracing himself against the mast, his hands so cold he could barely feel the delicate instrument, and in the few seconds the boat was on the crest of a wave, try to catch the sun's reflection and bring it down to the horizon line. His assistant would be ready with the chronometer to mark the exact time. It was a feat of seamanship that borders on the miraculous. His calculations, scribbled with a frozen pencil on a wet piece of paper, were the only thing keeping them from being swept out into the vast, empty expanse of the Southern Ocean, to disappear without a trace. Shackleton made it a point to keep the boats together. At least once a day, in a lull in the weather, he would have them pull alongside each other. He'd shout words of encouragement across the churning water. "How are you doing, lads?" The replies would be weak but cheerful. "All's well, boss." He'd oversee the doling out of rations, ensuring each man got his fair, tiny share. This simple act of staying connected was a vital psychological lifeline. It reminded them they were not alone. They were a single expedition, fighting a common enemy. One evening, as the boats bobbed together, the sea grew strangely calm. The men were exhausted, huddled in their wet, frozen clothes when a new terror appeared. A pod of orcas, killer whales, surfaced nearby. They were huge, their black fins slicing through the water. They circled the small boats, their breath exploding from their blowholes in misty plumes. One of them, a massive bull, dove directly beneath the James Caird and bumped the hull from below. The men could feel the immense power of the animal through the thin planks of wood. They were completely helpless. If the whales had decided to attack, it would have been over in seconds. The men sat in utter silence, holding their breath, gripping their oars, staring at the huge, intelligent eyes of the predators watching them. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the orcas lost interest and swam away, leaving the men trembling, not from the cold, but from a new and primal fear. The sea wasn't just indifferent, it was actively hostile, filled with things that could swallow them whole. The journey stretched on. Day 4, Day 5. The days blurred into a single, continuous ordeal of cold, thirst and exhaustion. The men's bodies were starting to break down. Their legs, cramped from sitting in one position for days on end, were swollen and painful. Saltwater sores erupted on their skin, raw, weeping patches that never healed in the constant dampness. Sleep was a fantasy. They would doze off for a few minutes at a time, slumped over an oar, their heads lolling, only to be jerked awake by a sudden lurch of the boat or a splash of icy water in the face. They began to have hallucinations. Men would see phantom ships on the horizon or imagine they were back home, warm in their beds, only to open their eyes to the grim reality of the grey sea and the ice-caked faces of their companions. Their destination was Elephant Island, a tiny, remote speck of land on the very edge of the Antarctic peninsula. It was uninhabited, unvisited, and a thoroughly dreadful place, but it was land, solid, unmoving land. Worsley's calculations suggested they were getting close, but in the constant fog and storms they couldn't be sure. Hope became a dangerous thing. A dark shape on the horizon would cause a surge of excitement, only for it to resolve into a familiar, hated iceberg. On the morning of the 7th day, the weather finally broke. The wind died down, and the fog began to lift. And then, through a gap in the clouds, they saw it. At first it was just a dark smudge against the sky, but it wasn't an iceberg. It didn't move. It was solid. It was land. A weak, croaking cheer went up from the boats. Some men wept openly, tears freezing on their cheeks. Others just stared, unable to process what they were seeing. After 497 days, nearly a year and a half, they were seeing land. They had been living on a diet of ice and water, and now here was the third element of the world, Earth. As they got closer, their destination revealed itself to be a grim and forbidding place. Sheer black cliffs rose thousands of feet out of the sea, with massive glaciers spilling down between them. There were no gentle beaches, no welcoming harbours. The waves crashed against the rocks with a thunderous roar. Finding a place to land was going to be another battle. They rowed along the coast, their bodies screaming with the effort, searching for a break in the cliffs. Their renewed hope gave them a final, desperate surge of strength. Finally, they spotted a small, narrow beach of stone and gravel, barely a foothold at the base of a towering glacier. It was their only chance. One by one, they guided the boats through the surf. It was a perilous landing. A rogue wave could have smashed them against the rocks, ending their journey just yards from their goal. But they made it. The keel of the James Caird scraped on the gravel. Men tumbled out into the shallow, freezing water, not even feeling the cold anymore. They staggered onto the beach, their legs unused to solid ground buckling beneath them. Some men fell to their knees and kissed the stones. Others just lay down on the beach, the solid, unmoving ground a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. For the first time in 497 days, they were standing on something that wasn't frozen water. The feeling was indescribable. It was a profound, elemental relief. The long journey from their sinking ship was over. They had done it. They had survived the ice. They had survived the open boat journey. They had reached land. They dragged the boats further up the beach, a final Herculean effort. Then, one by one, they collapsed. The cook managed to get the stove going, and soon the smell of a hot meal, the first in days, drifted over the small camp. For the first time in a week, they drank their fill of fresh water, melted from the glacier ice that towered over them. It was the sweetest, most wonderful drink any of them had ever tasted. But as the initial euphoria began to wear off, and they sat there gnawing on their seal steaks, a new reality began to dawn. They looked around at their new home. They were on a tiny, barren strip of rock and ice, hemmed in by impassable cliffs and glaciers. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest shipping lanes. No one in the world knew where they were. No one was coming for them. They had escaped the prison of the ice floe and the torture of the open boats, and they had arrived at another prison, a colder, stonier one. The relief of touching land was real, but it was immediately followed by the grim, quiet realization of their utter, absolute isolation. Their ordeal wasn't over. It had just entered a new, and perhaps even more hopeless chapter. Chapter 7, The Impossible Voyage. And so they settled into this new existence on Elephant Island, a life lived on a sliver of rock and ice, huddled under two upturned boats, with the constant grinding noise of the surf and the shrieking wind as their only soundtrack. The initial relief of solid ground, the joy of no longer being adrift on a melting ice floe, had evaporated with the morning sun, replaced by a chilling, clear-eyed assessment of their situation. This was not a haven, it was a cage, a much larger, much stonier cage, but a cage nonetheless. Every man knew it. You could see it in their eyes as they stared south, across the endless, churning grey water of the Drake Passage. No one was coming. They were 800 nautical miles from the nearest outpost of civilization, South Georgia, and that might as well have been the moon. They were so far off any known shipping lane that a rescue vessel would have a better chance of finding a specific snowflake in a blizzard. Hope is a strange and stubborn thing, but even it has its limits, and on Elephant Island it was beginning to fray. The men were exhausted, their clothes were in tatters, their bodies were worn down by months of hardship, and a diet that was making them weaker, not stronger. They could perhaps survive for a time. There were seals and penguins to hunt, but the Antarctic winter was rolling in like a slow-moving apocalypse. The days were shortening, the temperatures were plummeting, and the blizzards would soon become a near-permanent feature of their lives. Waiting here was not a strategy. It was a slow-motion surrender. It was a quiet agreement to lie down and let the cold take them, one by one. And Sir Ernest Shackleton, the boss, knew this better than anyone. He was a man built of restless energy and a ferocious, almost pathological optimism. To sit and wait was anathema to him. You can picture him there, standing apart from the others, his face chapped and bearded, the wind whipping at his worn woolens, staring not at the men, but out at that impossible ocean. He wasn't just looking at the waves, he was measuring them. He was calculating, he was weighing one form of certain death against another form of almost certain death. And in that grim arithmetic, he found the only path forward. The plan he formulated was so audacious, so utterly detached from the reality of their situation, that it bordered on madness. It was the kind of plan you'd expect from a desperate character in a novel, not a seasoned polar explorer. He would take one of the lifeboats. These were not ships, mind you. They were glorified, 22-foot rowboats, open to the sky, and he would attempt to sail it across 800 miles of the most ferocious and unpredictable ocean on the entire planet. He would aim for South Georgia. If he missed, the next stop was Africa, several thousand miles away, and they would simply vanish into the immensity of the South Atlantic. It was a single shot in the dark in a hurricane, at a target the size of a pinhead, on a map of the world. He gathered the men and told them there was no grand speech, just the quiet, firm laying out of facts. He would go, 5 others would come with him, the rest would stay, under the command of his second, the ever-reliable Frank Wild, and wait. They would have to ration, build a more permanent shelter, and simply hold on to the belief that the boss would somehow, against all logic and reason, succeed. The silence that followed must have been profound, broken only by the wind. They looked at the boat he had chosen, the James Caird. It was the largest and sturdiest of the 3, but that was like being the valedictorian of a class of dropouts. It was a double-ended whaler, built for the calm waters around a whaling ship, not for fighting the mountainous seas of the Southern Ocean. It seemed a flimsy, pathetic little thing to pin all their lives upon. To the men who would be left behind, it must have looked like a coffin. To the men who would go, it was their only, infinitesimally small chance. The decision was made. Now came the impossible task of turning this open boat into something that could even pretend to be an ocean-going vessel. And for that, Shackleton turned to one of the most quietly brilliant and cantankerous members of the expedition, Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter. McNish, or Chippy as he was known, was a Scotsman, a craftsman of the old school. He was also a realist, a socialist, and not a man who suffered fools, even when that fool was his commander. He had already clashed with Shackleton, most notably on the ice floe when he had briefly, and logically, argued that with the endurance gone, the rules of the sea no longer applied, and he didn't have to obey orders. Shackleton had put that mutiny down with a quiet threat of violence, but he never forgot McNish's skill. He knew that if anyone could make this insane plan a physical reality, it was this grumpy, brilliant carpenter who had already lost his beloved cat, Mrs. Chippy, to the exigencies of their survival. And so, with frozen fingers and a toolkit that was pitifully inadequate, McNish set to work. His task was monumental. He had to build a deck on an open boat, on a freezing beach, using nothing but scavenged scraps. There was no lumber yard, no hardware store. His materials were the remnants of their shattered expedition. He took the wooden lids from packing cases. He took the runners from the other 2 boats, the Stancombe Wills and the Dudley Docker. He foraged for every last splinter of wood he could find. We have to pause and appreciate the sheer genius of this. This wasn't a DIY project from a YouTube video, with power tools and pre-cut lumber. This was creation at its most fundamental. He built a frame, a sort of ridgepole running the length of the boat, and then painstakingly fitted the mismatched pieces of wood together to form a makeshift deck. This deck was low, just a couple of feet above the gunwales, creating a crawl space so cramped the men inside wouldn't be able to sit upright, but it would, in theory, keep the worst of the breaking waves from swamping them instantly. The seams, of course, were the problem. How do you waterproof a patchwork deck made of old boxes? This is where the ingenuity became almost primal. McNish used everything he had. He stuffed the cracks with lamp wick and marline, and then he sealed it all with a concoction that speaks volumes about their desperation. He mixed oil paint with seal blood. Imagine that, the sticky, dark, coagulating blood of the animals they had killed to eat, mixed with the last of their paint, smeared into every crack and crevice. The boat itself was being sealed with the lifeblood of their environment, a grim sacrament to their survival. The work was agonizing. The wood was frozen solid. A nail, if you could find one, would bend or shatter the wood if not handled with incredible care. McNish's hands were raw with frostbite, his fingers stiff and clumsy. The other men helped where they could, holding pieces in place, their own hands burning with the cold. The wind was a constant thief, trying to rip the pieces from their grasp. Each hammer blow was a small victory against the encroaching despair. Macnish didn't stop with the deck. He knew the boat would be battered. He reinforced the keel, using the mast of one of the other boats. He raised the height of the boat's sides, the gunwales, by about a foot, using canvas stretched over wooden laths, giving them a tiny bit more freeboard, a few more precious inches between them and the ocean. Every modification was a testament to his foresight. He knew what the sea could do. He wasn't just building a boat, he was building a suit of armour for 6 men. Inside, the boat was ballasted, not with lead or iron, but with stones gathered from the beach of Elephant Island and bags made from blankets filled with sand. They also took 2 casks of fresh water, carefully filled from the melting glaciers, and the precious remaining food supplies. It was all calculated to the last ounce. Too much weight and the boat would be sluggish, unable to rise with the waves. Too little, and it would be tossed about like a cork, liable to be flipped over by the first big wave. As Macnish toiled, Shackleton made his other crucial decision: who to take. This wasn't about choosing his friends, it was about choosing a human toolkit, a combination of skills and temperaments that could withstand unimaginable stress. First and most essential was Frank Worsley, the captain of the Endurance. Wuzzles, as he was known, was a New Zealander and a navigational genius. His ability to find their position on a map using a sextant, a chronometer, and the sun was their only hope of actually finding South Georgia. Without Worsley, the voyage was pointless. They would just be 6 men sailing to their deaths in a random direction. Then there was Tom Crean, an Irishman, a giant of a man, and a veteran of Scott's Antarctic expeditions. Crean was unbelievably tough, cheerful in the face of absolute misery, and utterly unshakably loyal. He was the engine room of the crew, the man whose spirit Shackleton knew would never break. If you were going to hell in a lifeboat, you wanted Tom Crean rowing alongside you. For the other 2 spots, he chose 2 sailors, John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy. Vincent was strong, an able seaman who had been a bit of a bully and a troublemaker, but Shackleton knew his physical power would be essential. McCarthy was young, optimistic, and also a very skilled sailor. Shackleton believed their seamanship would be critical. And the 6th man, of course, was the carpenter himself, Harry Macnish. Shackleton needed him, not just because he had built the boat, but because if anything broke, and everything was going to break, Macnish was the only one who had a chance of fixing it. It was a tense relationship. Macnish had not forgiven Shackleton for having his cat shot, and Shackleton had not forgotten Macnish's brief mutiny, but mutual respect for their respective skills transcended personal feelings. Survival demanded it. The day of departure was April 24th, 1916. The Antarctic winter was closing in fast. It was now or never. The James Caird was loaded, the final preparations made. The whole ragged community of 28 men gathered on the stony beach to see them off. It must have been one of the most poignant and dreadful farewells in human history. The 22 men being left behind watched the 6 men clamber into their makeshift vessel. There were no grand cheers, no rousing speeches, just handshakes, quiet words of good luck, and the unspoken knowledge hanging in the frigid air that they might never see each other again. The men on the shore helped push the James Caird out through the treacherous surf, the icy water surging up to their waists. They watched as the small sail, sewn from 2 old tents, was hoisted. It caught the wind, and the little boat, their last desperate gamble, began to pull away from the island. For the men on the shore, watching it shrink into a tiny speck on the vast grey heaving ocean was like watching their own hope sail away over the horizon. They were now utterly alone, with nothing to do but wait and try not to die. They turned back to their upturned boats and began the long, cold vigil. For the 6 men in the James Caird, the ordeal began immediately. The relative shelter of Elephant Island vanished behind them, and they were introduced to the full, unbridled fury of the Southern Ocean. The world became a maelstrom of grey and white. Waves, the size of rolling hills, rose up around them. These weren't the waves you see at a beach. They were vast, powerful swells of water, born from uninterrupted winds circling the entire globe. They called this latitude the Furious 50s for a reason. The James Caird would climb the face of one of these liquid mountains, teetering on its crest for a heart-stopping moment, revealing a terrifying panorama of endless angry sea, before plunging down into the trough on the other side, the sail going slack as the walls of water on either side blocked the wind. The cold was a physical assault. The temperature of the water was just above freezing. The air was colder. Every wave that broke over the bow sent a cascade of liquid ice across their makeshift deck. and through every tiny, unsealed crack. Within minutes, everything and everyone was soaked, and there was no possibility of ever getting dry. Their woolen clothes became saturated, clinging to them like a second skin made of ice. Their reindeer skin sleeping bags, their one source of comfort, became sodden, frozen lumps. Life aboard the James Caird quickly settled into a monotonous cycle of misery. The space was incredibly cramped. The area under the low deck was meant for the 3 men who were off watch to rest, but rest was impossible. It was a dark, cramped space, filled with the shifting stone ballast. The men would crawl in, wriggling over the stones, trying to find a position where the jagged edges weren't digging into their ribs or spine. They would lie there in the darkness, soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, listening to the roar of the sea just inches above their heads, and the constant, unnerving creaking and groaning of the boat's timbers as it twisted and flexed under the immense pressure. Sleep was a fantasy. They could only drift into a state of semi-conscious, shivering stupor for a few hours at a time. The 3 men on watch had it even worse. 2 men would be handling the sail and the tiller, fighting to keep the boat pointed in the right direction, a constant, exhausting battle against the wind and waves. The 3rd man's job was simply to bail. The boat leaked constantly. From the seams in the deck and from the hull itself, water sloshed around their feet, a freezing soup that numbed their limbs. Bailing was a full-time job, a desperate, continuous effort to throw the ocean back where it belonged. They used a small hand pump and whatever containers they had, but it was a losing battle. They weren't keeping the boat dry, they were just keeping it from sinking. Their diet was as grim as their surroundings. Their stove, a small primus, was a precious artifact. To light it in the pitching, spray-filled boat was a major operation. Tom Crean was usually the cook. He would huddle in the tiny space at the bow, shielding the stove with his body, trying to melt chunks of ice to get fresh water and heat up their hoosh, a thick stew made of sledging rations, basically a high-energy porridge of lard, oatmeal and meat protein. This hot meal, served once a day, was the central ritual of their existence. It was the only source of warmth they had, a brief blessed heat that spread through their chests before the cold reclaimed them. They drank it in mugs, cradling them in their frozen hands, the steam warming their faces. In that context, this greasy, lumpy gruel was the most delicious food imaginable. It was life. But the ocean was not content to just make them miserable. It seemed actively to be trying to kill them. The wind rose to hurricane force. The waves became truly monstrous. Shackleton would later write of seeing the largest waves of his entire life on this voyage. One particular rogue wave nearly ended it all. Shackleton was at the tiller, and he saw what he thought was a line of clearing sky on the horizon. It wasn't until the line rose higher that he realized with a jolt of pure terror that it wasn't the sky. It was the breaking crest of a colossal wave, an abnormal monster that had built up in the storm. He screamed a warning. For God's sake, hold on. It's got us. The wave crashed down on them with the force of an explosion. The little boat was thrown sideways, submerged, filled with a churning mass of water. The men were convinced it was the end, but somehow, miraculously, the James Caird, buoyant and resilient, shook itself free. It shuddered, shed the water, and rose back to the surface, half swamped but still afloat. The men, gasping and terrified, immediately began bailing for their lives. McNish's work had held. The little boat had survived a knockout punch from the ocean heavyweight champion. Another, more insidious enemy appeared: ice. The constant spray and freezing temperatures began to coat the boat in a thick, heavy layer of ice. The deck, the mast, the sails, everything was encased. It looked beautiful, like a crystal sculpture, but it was deadly. The weight of the ice was accumulating, making the boat top-heavy, threatening to capsize them. It had to be removed, so in the midst of the storm, the men had to crawl out onto the treacherous, icy deck, with the boat lurching and plunging beneath them. They would chip away at the ice with any tool they could find, their hands so numb they could barely grip. One slip would have meant being thrown into the freezing water, a death sentence of minutes. It was a terrifying Sisyphean task. No sooner had they cleared one section than another would be coated again. Day after day, the ordeal continued. The men's bodies began to break down. Their skin was raw with saltwater sores. Their feet were swollen and numb with trench foot from the constant immersion in icy water. Their hands were cracked and bleeding. Thirst became a major problem. One of the water casks broke loose in the storm and was contaminated with seawater, cutting their supply in half. They were rationed to half a pint of water a day, a cruel torture in an environment where they were surrounded by an infinite amount of undrinkable water. Their tongues swelled in their mouths, and their lips cracked, and through all of this, the entire purpose of the mission rested on the shoulders of one man, Frank Worsley. His task was navigation, and what he accomplished was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest feats of seamanship in history. To navigate, you need to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon at a precise moment in time. This is called taking a sight. You do this with a sextant. For it to work, you need three things: a stable platform to stand on, a clear view of the horizon, and a clear view of the sun. Worsley had none of these. His platform was a 22-foot boat being thrown around like a child's toy. The horizon was almost never visible, obscured by the towering waves or the spray, and the sun was almost always hidden behind a thick, impenetrable blanket of grey cloud. For days on end, Worsley couldn't take a single reading. They were sailing blind, by dead reckoning, which is basically a sophisticated form of guesswork, estimating your speed and direction. But dead reckoning is notoriously inaccurate. A small error in your estimated speed, a slight misjudgment of the ocean currents, and over 800 miles, you could be off by 100 miles or more. Missing South Georgia to the north was bad. Missing it to the south meant sailing into the empty void of the Atlantic until you starved. So Worsley waited. He lived with the sextant practically strapped to him, waiting for a break. Every so often, for just a few minutes, the clouds would thin. A pale, watery disk of the sun would appear, and in that moment, the entire crew would spring into action. It was a well-rehearsed drill. Two men, usually Crean and McCarthy, would grab Worsley and hold him steady, bracing him against the violent motion of the boat. Worsley, his eyes streaming from the wind and spray, would lift the sextant, trying to bring the tiny image of the sun down to meet the fleeting, lurching line of the horizon. He would have maybe a minute, two at most, before the clouds closed in again. In that tiny window, he had to get his reading. He would take 4 or 5 sights if he could, his frozen fingers fumbling with the delicate instrument. Then he would crawl back into the dark, wet hell under the deck to do his calculations. Imagine the scene. Worsley, huddled in the cramped darkness, his book of logarithmic tables soaked and warped, trying to work out complex equations by the light of a flickering blubber lamp. He's shivering. His mind is fogged with exhaustion and dehydration. But he knows that the lives of all 28 men of the expedition depend on him getting this right. He would work out their position, make a small X on his sodden chart, and give Shackleton the new course. He managed to get a reliable sight only 4 times during the entire 16-day voyage, 4 moments of clarity in over 2 weeks of blindness, and from those 4 readings he guided them across 800 miles of ocean. It wasn't just skill, it was art. It was an intuitive, almost mystical connection between the man, his instruments, and the chaotic world around him. The physical toll on the men was becoming severe. Vincent, the strong sailor, was collapsing. The cold and the relentless hardship had broken him. Macnish, the carpenter, was also fading fast. His old aches and pains combined with the brutal conditions were grinding him down. Shackleton, Crean, and McCarthy seemed to be made of something else entirely, some kind of polar-proof material. They carried the extra workload, their willpower refusing to bend. After about 2 weeks, they knew they should be getting close, but where was the land? Doubt began to creep in. Had Worsley made a mistake? Had they sailed past it in a storm? The strain was immense. They were at the absolute limit of their endurance. Their water was almost gone. They started to see signs of land, seaweed floating in the water, birds they hadn't seen in the deep ocean. Hope and fear battled within them. And then, on the morning of May 8th, through a gap in the driving rain and mist, McCarthy, who was at the tiller, let out a shout. Land. There it was, a dark, jagged line of rock and ice, barely visible through the storm. It was South Georgia. They had made it. After 16 days of unimaginable hell, Worsley's miraculous navigation had brought them to their target. The relief that washed over them was so profound it was almost painful. Some of the men wept openly, the tears freezing on their chapped faces. They had done the impossible, but the ocean hadn't finished with them yet. As they approached the island, the storm that had been their companion for 2 weeks intensified into a full-blown hurricane. The wind shrieked, and the sea became a white chaos of breaking waves. They were being driven towards the rocky, cliff-lined coast. To be thrown onto those rocks would mean being smashed to pieces in seconds. Their journey couldn't end like this, not after everything they had endured. For another 9 agonizing hours, they fought to keep the boat off the coast. They were too weak to row against the wind, so they had to use their sea anchor, a sort of underwater parachute, to hold their position. But the line to the anchor chafed and snapped. They were adrift again, at the mercy of the storm. All they could do was try to keep the boat's head into the wind and pray. The boat was taking a horrific beating. The water, which they had been bailing for 2 weeks, was now pouring in faster than they could get it out. The mast was in danger of snapping. They were, in Shackleton's words, a speck of human daring in the great storm. They survived the night, a night that must have felt like an eternity. By morning, the storm had begun to abate. The wind shifted, and they saw a break in the cliffs, an inlet. It was King Haakon Bay. With their last reserves of strength, they steered the battered, half-swamped James Caird towards the entrance. They navigated through the reefs, and finally, into the calmer waters of the bay. They saw a beach. They paddled the last few yards, and the boat's keel scraped against the stones. They stumbled out of the boat onto solid ground. They could barely stand. Their legs, unused to walking, buckled beneath them. They fell to their knees on the rocky beach. They were alive. They were on land. The impossible voyage was over. They found a small cave, and for the first time in 16 days they were out of the wind. They managed to light the primus stove. They cooked a meal, and then they slept. Not the shivering, semi-conscious stupor of the boat, but a deep, profound sleep of utter, absolute exhaustion. They had sailed a 22-foot boat across the world's most dangerous ocean, in winter, and survived. It was a feat of endurance and navigation that stands almost without parallel. But as they slept, safe for the first time in months, they knew their ordeal still wasn't over. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations, their ultimate goal, were on the other side, across a treacherous, unmapped and supposedly impassable mountain range of glaciers and crevasses. Their journey was not finished. They had merely reached the starting line for its final desperate leg. Chapter 8. The Final Barrier. And what a starting line it was. Not a ribbon to be cut, not a cheering crowd, but a wall of black rock and white ice that clawed its way into a perpetually grey and hostile sky. From their miserable camp in what they'd grimly named Peggotty Camp, a nook under the upturned boat, the view was a daily reminder of their predicament. It was a geography of despair. Before them lay the Allardyce Range, a spine of mountains so formidable, so utterly unknown, that no one had ever even considered crossing it. The whalers, tough Norwegian men who wrestled with leviathans for a living, stuck to the coasts. They knew the interior was a place where things went to die. It was a blank spot on the map, and in the collective imagination of those who knew the island, it was simply labelled impassable. For Ernest Shackleton, impassable was just a suggestion. It was a problem to be solved, not a verdict to be accepted. The alternative was to get back in the James Caird and try to round the island by sea. But one look at the state of his men, and the boat itself, told him that was a death sentence. The southern coast of South Georgia is a place of legendary storms, of winds that can pick up the sea and throw it against the land. The Caird was a miracle boat, but its miracles were finite. Frank Worsley, the skipper, a man who could navigate by smelling the wind, flatly said they wouldn't last a day. The boat was taking on water, and the men were running on fumes, so the sea was out. That left the land, the impassable land. A small council of war was held. There were 6 of them, survivors of the Voyage: Shackleton, Worsley, Tom Crean, Harry McNeish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. Shackleton looked at his crew. They were not the strong, boisterous men who had left England almost 2 years ago. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed figures, their faces blackened by months of blubber smoke, their clothes in tatters. McNeish, the carpenter, was physically broken. The punishing journey in the boat had ravaged his body, and his spirit wasn't far behind. Vincent, the burly trawler hand, was in even worse shape, a shadow of his former self, barely able to function. To ask these 2 men to cross a mountain range was not to ask for a miracle, it was to ask them to walk to their own execution. McCarthy was young and resilient, but still utterly spent. The decision was clear. If brutal, Shackleton would go. He would take the 2 strongest men with him, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean. Worsley, the wiry, seemingly indestructible navigator from New Zealand, whose optimism was a force of nature in itself, and Crean, the giant, quiet Irishman, a man of immense physical strength and an even greater internal fortitude. If you needed to walk through hell and back, you wanted Tom Crean by your side. The other 3, McNeish, Vincent, and McCarthy, would stay behind. They would be left under the shelter of the boat, with what little food remained. Shackleton promised them he would be back. It was a promise made against astronomical odds, a whisper of hope against a hurricane of statistical impossibility. But they believed him. They had to. Now came the matter of preparation. If you were to plan a similar alpine crossing today, your living room would be buried under a mountain of high-tech gear, Gore-Tex jackets, insulated boots, titanium ice axes, GPS devices, high-energy food bars, climbing harnesses, headlamps. The packing list for Shackleton, Worsley and Crean was, to put it politely, minimalist. It was a collection of items that would seem comically inadequate if the circumstances weren't so dire. They had no tent. They had no sleeping bags. Their plan was to simply not stop, to walk for as long as it took, a non-stop 36-hour push across the frozen heart of the island. For footwear, they had their worn, battered leather boots, stiff with salt water and frozen solid. Macnish, the carpenter, ever the pragmatist, performed one last crucial act of service. He took screws from the hull of the James Caird, screws that had literally held their world together for 17 days on the ocean, and hammered them through the soles of their boots. It was a desperate, ingenious move, creating a set of makeshift crampons. A few small pieces of metal were all that would stand between them and a fatal slip into a crevasse. For climbing equipment, they had a single, small carpenter's adze, not an ice axe designed for mountaineering, but a wood-shaping tool. It would have to do. They also had 50 feet of worn rope. This rope wasn't some modern lightweight kernmantle line. It was a simple, coarse rope that had been on the sea for years. It was their lifeline, the physical representation of their interdependence. They would be tied together for the entire journey. A chain of 3 men moving as one. A fall for one would be a fall for all, unless the other 2 could hold. Their navigation equipment consisted of Worsley's chronometer, which he babied like a newborn, and a compass. No map, of course, because no map existed. They would be navigating by instinct, by Worsley's almost supernatural sense of direction, and by whatever glimpses of the sun or stars the perpetually stormy sky would allow them. And for food, the thought is almost painful. They took 3 days' rations, which in their world meant a few biscuits and some of the sledging ration called hoosh, a high-fat, high-protein concoction of lard, oatmeal and meat powder. They would carry it in their socks. They packed 2 small primer stoves for melting snow into water, but they worried constantly about the fuel. It was barely enough. On the 19th of May, 1916, at 2 in the morning, under the light of a full moon that occasionally broke through the racing clouds, they set off. They said their goodbyes to the 3 men left behind. It was a quiet, understated affair. A handshake, a look in the eye, the simple words, "We'll be back for you." Then, the 3 of them, Shackleton, Worsley and Crean, turned their backs on the sea that had been their prison and their salvation, and started to walk into the white, silent unknown. The first part of the journey was a deceptively gentle ascent up a snow-covered glacier. The moonlight was a blessing, turning the landscape into a ghostly, beautiful world of silver and shadow, but the beauty was menacing. The smooth surface of the snow could be hiding anything. Every step was a probe into the unknown. They moved rope together, Shackleton in the lead, using the adze to test the ground ahead, listening for the hollow sound that signified a crevasse hidden beneath a fragile snow bridge. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots, the whisper of the wind, and the sound of their own ragged breathing, which turned to plumes of steam in the frigid air. The cold was a living thing. It wasn't just a lack of heat. It was an active, aggressive presence that sought out every gap in their worn-out clothing. It seeped through the threadbare wool, numbed their fingers and toes, and bit at any exposed skin on their faces. Their beards became helmets of ice. The work of climbing kept their core body temperature up, but the moment they stopped, even for a few seconds, the cold would sink its teeth in, deep and painful. As the hours wore on, the initial adrenaline gave way to a grueling, monotonous slog. It was a simple, brutal rhythm. Kick a step into the snow, plant your foot, breathe, bring the other foot up, repeat. For hours on end, their world shrank to the few feet of snow in front of them, the comforting tautness of the rope, and the back of the man ahead. They were climbing into a featureless void, with no sense of progress other than the burning ache in their thighs and the screaming of their lungs. Worsley, ever the navigator, tried to keep a mental map, to triangulate their position based on the distant peaks and the angle of their ascent, but the island was a disorienting maze. What looked like a gentle pass from below would reveal itself to be the lip of a sheer cliff. What seemed like a direct route would lead them into a labyrinth of icefalls and impassable crevasses. They were ants crawling across a crumpled-up piece of paper, with no idea what lay over the next fold. As the short Antarctic day dawned, it brought not clarity but fog. A thick, wet, bone-chilling fog rolled in from the sea, reducing their visibility to just a few yards. The world dissolved into a uniform, pearly grey. This was a navigator's nightmare. Worsley's compass was still useful for general direction, but they were now effectively blind. They were climbing a mountain without being able to see the mountain. They could be walking in circles, or straight towards a cliff edge. The fear was constant, a low hum beneath the physical exhaustion. They pressed on, driven by the simple, terrifying logic that to stop was to die. By late afternoon, after more than 12 hours of continuous climbing, they believed they had reached the main ridge. They stood on a summit, gasping in the thin, cold air, and for a moment the fog parted. They were granted a view, and it was a view of utter horror. On the other side, the side they needed to descend, was not a gentle slope, but a sheer 1,000-foot drop, a curtain of ice and rock falling away into the abyss. They were on the wrong peak. All those hours of effort, all that energy expended, had led them to a dead end. The psychological blow was immense. It was the kind of moment that breaks people, to be so tired you can barely think, so cold you can barely feel, and to realize you have made a catastrophic mistake. In his journal, Shackleton would later describe it as one of the lowest moments of his life. They were at an altitude of over 4,000 feet. The sun was beginning to set, and they knew they couldn't survive a night exposed on the summit. The temperature was plummeting. They had to get down, and they had to get down now. Retracing their steps was an option, but it would take hours. Hours they didn't have. Darkness would fall, and descending the treacherous glacier they had just climbed would be suicidal. It was Shackleton who saw the only other way. It was not a path, it was a gamble. A steep, snow-covered slope that fell away into the fog below. It might have been a smooth run down to a lower glacier, or it might have been riddled with crevasses or ended in a cliff. There was no way to know. Shackleton looked at Worsley and Crean. Their faces were masks of exhaustion, ice clinging to their beards. He explained the idea. They would coil the rope, sit on it to use as a makeshift toboggan, and slide, all three of them together. A human train hurtling down a mountain into the unknown. It was an insane idea, a complete abdication of control to gravity and blind luck. Worsley, ever the cheerful one, apparently giggled and said, "It's a devil of a risk, boss, but I think we'll have to take it." Crean, as usual, just nodded. He was ready, so they sat down, one behind the other, Shackleton in front to steer with his feet, Worsley wrapping his arms around Shackleton's waist, and Crean wrapping his arms around Worsley's. They tucked the adze between them, took a deep breath, and pushed off. The initial acceleration was terrifying. They shot down the slope at a speed that felt impossible, the icy wind tearing at their faces, the world a blur of white. For a minute, perhaps two, they were no longer climbers. They were a projectile. They had no control. They flew over bumps, became airborne, and slammed back down onto the snow. All they could do was hold on to each other and hope that the slope didn't end in a cliff, hope that a crevasse didn't yawn open to swallow them whole. It was a descent made in a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, mixed with an almost hysterical glee. They were so tired, so far beyond the normal limits of human endurance, that this mad slide felt like a release. After hours of painstaking, agonizingly slow progress, they were finally moving fast. In those 2 minutes they descended over 1,000 vertical feet, a distance that would have taken them hours to downclimb safely. They finally skidded to a halt in a soft snowbank at the bottom, a tangled heap of limbs and rope. They stood up shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline. They looked back up the slope they had just conquered in a moment of inspired madness, and then they started to laugh. A ragged, breathless, almost unhinged laughter that echoed in the vast, silent amphitheatre of the mountains. They had stared into the abyss and gambled, and for now they had won. But their journey was far from over. The night was now fully upon them. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, and they were plunged into a profound darkness. They were on a lower glacier, but they still had to cross it, and then climb another ridge beyond. They stumbled on through the night, a 3-man ghost train in a frozen wasteland. The cold deepened, becoming a physical pain that was impossible to ignore. Sleep deprivation began to play tricks on their minds. Their thoughts became fuzzy, disjointed. They would find themselves falling asleep as they walked, stumbling forward for a few steps in a dreamlike state before a jerk on the rope from the man in front or behind would snap them back to a grim reality. They started to see things, shapes in the snow, figures moving at the edge of their vision. and it was here that the strangest phenomenon of the journey occurred. Each of them independently had the persistent, unshakable feeling that there were not 3 of them walking, but 4. It wasn't a frightening feeling. It was a quiet, comforting presence, a 4th man walking beside them, sharing their burden. They never spoke of it at the time. It was too strange, too personal. It was only weeks later, when they were safe, that Shackleton asked Worsley and Crean about it, and discovered they had all felt the exact same thing, a silent, unseen companion on the ice, a mystery they would take with them for the rest of their lives. They marched on. The body becomes a machine in these moments. The mind shuts down all non-essential functions. There is only the next step, and the one after that. They stopped briefly to chew on a biscuit, their jaws aching with the effort. They brewed a small amount of hot liquid with their primer stove, a foul-tasting slurry of hoosh, which was nonetheless the most wonderful thing they had ever tasted. It sent a wave of warmth through their frozen bodies, a small flicker of life in the overwhelming cold. Just before dawn, they heard a sound, a faint, unfamiliar noise carried on the wind. They stopped, straining to listen. It was the sound of a steam whistle. For a moment, they didn't believe it. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the wind, or their exhausted minds creating the sound they so desperately wanted to hear. They stood frozen, barely breathing, waiting, and then it came again. Clearer this time. The unmistakable, shrill blast of a whistle from a ship or a factory. It was the sound of industry, the sound of other people, the sound of the world they had left behind 2 years ago. Tom Crean, the stoic, unbreakable Irishman, sat down in the snow and wept. Shackleton and Worsley had tears freezing on their cheeks. It was a sound that signified the end of their ordeal. It meant they had done it. They had crossed the impassable island. They weren't saved yet, but for the first time they knew they would be. The sound came from the Stromness whaling station. They had walked in the right direction. This surge of hope gave them a final, almost superhuman burst of energy. But the island had one last cruel trick to play. As the sun rose, they saw the whaling station below them, nestled in a small bay, but between them and it was a final descent, a chaos of icefalls and steep frozen waterfalls. There was no easy way down. Tired as they were, they couldn't risk another mad slide, so they had to backtrack once more, finding a long, circuitous route down. It was a strange, almost comical descent. They were so weak that they kept falling, sliding down snowy banks on their backsides, getting tangled in the rope. They looked like wild men. Their faces were black, their hair and beards were long and matted, their eyes were wild and bloodshot, and their clothes were in rags. They were apparitions from another world. As they neared the station, they had to navigate a final, small, frozen waterfall. Shackleton went first. Cutting steps with the adze, Crean and Worsley followed. At the bottom, they stopped to make themselves look, as Shackleton put it, more or less respectable. They tried to brush the ice from their beards and straighten their tattered clothes. It was a profoundly human, slightly absurd gesture after 36 hours of surviving hell. Their first instinct upon re-entering civilization was to worry about their appearance. They walked into the outskirts of the Stromness whaling station. The first people they saw were 2 small children, who took one look at these terrifying, wild-eyed figures and ran away screaming. They found a workman, who also stared at them in disbelief and backed away. Finally, they were directed to the manager's house. The manager, a Norwegian man named Mr. Sorlow, came to the door. He looked at the 3 apparitions standing before him. He saw their blackened faces, their rags, their makeshift crampons. He had no idea who they were. Shackleton, his voice hoarse and cracking from thirst and disuse, spoke. "My name is Shackleton," he said. Mr. Sorrell looked at him, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. The world had long since given up the Endurance for lost. Shackleton and his men were presumed dead, swallowed by the Antarctic ice more than a year ago. It was impossible, and yet here he was. The long journey was over. They had walked off the edge of the map and found their way back. They were safe, but as the warmth of the manager's house began to seep into their frozen bones, Shackleton's mind was already turning back to the men he had left behind. 3 men huddled under a boat on the other side of the island, and 22 men marooned on a desolate strip of icebound land called Elephant Island, hundreds of miles away, waiting. For him, the final barrier had been crossed, but the mission was not yet complete. Chapter 9. No Man Abandoned. They had walked off the edge of the map and found their way back. They were safe, but as the warmth of the manager's house began to seep into their frozen bones, Shackleton's mind was already turning back to the men he had left behind. 3 men huddled under a boat on the other side of the island, and 22 men marooned on a desolate strip of icebound land called Elephant Island, hundreds of miles away, waiting. For him, the final barrier had been crossed, but the mission was not yet complete. There is a peculiar kind of exhaustion that comes not after the struggle, but in the brief, quiet moment just before the next one begins. For Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, that moment was fleeting. They were heroes, yes. They had accomplished one of the most astonishing feats of navigation and survival ever recorded. But heroism is a heavy coat to wear, especially when you know the story isn't over. For every warm cup of tea they were handed, for every marvelling question they were asked by the whalers at Stromness, the image of Frank Wild and his 21 companions would have been superimposed over it all, a ghostly counterpoint to their own survival. They were waiting on a miserable strip of shingle beach, barely 200 yards long, hemmed in by sheer black cliffs and gargantuan groaning glaciers. They were living under 2 upturned boats, a makeshift hovel they'd christened the Snuggery, a name so deeply ironic it was almost painful. Their world had shrunk to this one patch of land, where their diet consisted of penguin, seal, and the occasional limpets they could pry from the rocks. Their calendar was the slow, agonizing creep of the Antarctic winter, and their only hope was the impossible belief that the boss, as they called him, would somehow find his way back through the worst seas on the planet. Shackleton knew this. He felt it in his bones. The congratulations of the whalers felt hollow. He was a general whose main army was still pinned down behind enemy lines. Within 3 days of arriving at Stromness, having barely had time to let the feeling return to his fingers and toes, he was already setting out on his first rescue attempt. There was no time to waste. Winter was not coming. It was already there, locking the Southern Ocean in its icy grip. He secured the use of a large whaling vessel, the Southern Sky. It was a solid ship, but it was a whaler, not an icebreaker. It wasn't built for the kind of work he was about to ask of it. Still, it was available, and it was fast. With Worsley and Crean at his side, men who surely deserved a long rest but would never have dreamt of taking one, they steamed south. The mood must have been one of grim, determined optimism. They had beaten the odds once. They had sailed the James Caird through the hurricane-force winds of the Drake Passage. Surely a modern steamship could make short work of the return journey. The ocean, however, had other ideas. Antarctica doesn't give up its prizes easily. As they neared Elephant Island, the temperature plummeted. The sea, which had been a roiling, angry grey, began to change its texture. It grew sluggish, thick, like slush in a gutter. Then came the first pans of ice, ghostly white shapes rocking in the swell. Soon they were navigating a maze of them. Worsley, on the bridge, would have been using all his uncanny skill to weave the ship through the gaps. But the gaps began to close. The playful pans of ice grew into vast groaning floes, miles wide. They eventually met the pack, not just scattered ice, but a solid, seemingly impenetrable wall of it, stretching from horizon to horizon. It was a white desert, a continent of frozen sea, and it stood as a sentinel, guarding the island. They pushed the Southern Sky into the looser edges of it, the steel hull screaming in protest as it scraped against the ice. They would push forward a few hundred yards, only to be stopped by a floe the size of a city block. They tried to go around it, steaming west, then east, looking for any channel, any lead of open water that might take them south. For 3 days, they skirted this frozen fortress. The cold was immense. Every spray of sea foam froze instantly where it landed on the ship's deck, and rigging, encasing the entire vessel in a sheath of glittering ice. Shackleton stood on the bridge, staring south through his binoculars, his frustration a palpable thing. He was only 70 miles away from his men. 70 miles. He could practically feel their presence. He imagined them scanning the northern horizon, waiting for the plume of smoke that would signal their salvation. But those 70 miles might as well have been 1,000,000. The ice was too thick, the ship wasn't strong enough, and the winter was tightening its hold with every passing hour. To push on would be suicide. It would mean trapping the Southern Sky and its crew, adding more men to the list of those who needed rescuing. The decision to turn back was an agony. For a man like Shackleton, whose entire philosophy was built on pushing forward, on enduring one more step, retreat was a physical poison. As the Southern Sky turned its bow north, away from the island, away from his men, it must have felt like the most profound failure of his life. He had left them with a promise, and on his first attempt to keep it, the Antarctic had simply said no. They made for the Falkland Islands, the nearest civilized port with a telegraph cable. Here, Shackleton sent a message to London. informing the world of the loss of the Endurance and the survival of his crew, but also of their desperate plight. He needed a more suitable ship, and he needed it now. But the world, in 1916, had other things on its mind. The Battle of the Somme was raging in Europe. The Great War was consuming men and materials at an unimaginable rate. A handful of explorers stranded on a forgotten island at the bottom of the world was, to be brutally honest, a footnote. There were no icebreakers to spare, no naval vessels that could be diverted. Shackleton was on his own. He sailed on to Punta Arenas in Chile, the southernmost city in the world. Here the British community rallied around him. They raised money, they offered support. He was a hero to them, a living legend, but they had no icebreakers. He pleaded with the Uruguayan government, who generously offered the use of a small, 10-year-old steam trawler, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1. It was all they had. It was a vessel designed for charting fishing grounds in temperate waters. It had a single, unreliable engine, and was woefully unsuited for a voyage into the Antarctic. But it was a ship, and Shackleton was a man who could not sit still. So, with a volunteer crew, they set out again. This was his second attempt. If the first had been a calculated risk, this was a desperate gamble. The little trawler was tossed about mercilessly by the furious seas of the Drake Passage. It made agonizingly slow progress. Twice, the engine failed. They were battered by a gale that threatened to tear the small vessel apart, and once again, as they approached the coordinates of Elephant Island, they met the ice. The pack had shifted, but it had not weakened. It was a relentless moving wall. The tiny trawler was a toy against its power. To even touch the edge of the pack would have been to risk being crushed like a walnut. Once again, with a heavy heart, Shackleton was forced to order a retreat. 2 attempts, 2 failures. The winter was now at its absolute peak. The sun would be barely skimming the horizon each day. The temperatures on Elephant Island would be unimaginably low, and the hope of the men left there, what must that be like? With each passing week, it would be harder and harder to cling to the belief that the boss was coming back. Doubt is a cold that seeps in deeper than any frost. Back in Punta Arenas, the despair must have been settling in. The window of opportunity was closing. He had tried a whaler. He had tried a trawler. He needed something stronger, but there was nothing to be had. Yet the local community had not given up on him. A British expatriate named Alan MacDonald heard of his plight and offered to charter a third vessel, a small schooner named the Emma. It was a wooden ship with an auxiliary engine, but it was sturdy. It was not an icebreaker, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could do the job. This was the third attempt. It began with a touch of the absurd. The Emma's engine was not powerful enough to fight the gales of the Drake Passage on its own, so they had to be towed for the first part of the journey by a naval tug. Imagine the scene, a small wooden schooner, destined for the most dangerous waters in the world, being pulled along like a recalcitrant child. Then the inevitable storm hit. The tow rope snapped. The Emma's own engine, when they finally got it started, sputtered and strained against the immense waves. It broke down. They fixed it. It broke down again. For a week they battled the sea in this tiny, crippled boat. They were making no progress, and once again they met the ice, a barrier that seemed to have a personal vendetta against him. 3 failures. It was now August. The men had been on Elephant Island since April. 4 months. 4 months of living on a diet of seal and penguin, in constant cold and damp, with the unending deafening noise of the wind and the sea, and the cracking glaciers. 4 months of staring at an empty horizon. Most people would have given up. They would have concluded it was impossible, that the men were lost, and that they had done all that could be reasonably expected. But Ernest Shackleton was not most people. His sense of responsibility was absolute. He had taken these men south. He would bring them back. Failure was not an option he was capable of processing. He returned to Chile, a man now visibly worn down by the stress and the repeated disappointments. But he had one last card to play. He went directly to the Chilean government. He laid out his case with all the passion and conviction he could muster. He spoke of the 22 men, of their loyalty, of his promise, and Chile responded. They offered him the Yelcho, a small steel-hulled steam tug. On paper, the Yelcho was a terrible choice. It was small, it had no radio, it had no double hull for protection against ice, it had no heating of any kind, not even in the sleeping quarters. Its crew would be sleeping in freezing conditions. It was a harbour tug, designed to nudge larger ships into port, not to brave the Antarctic pack, but it had 2 things going for it. It was made of steel, which was better than wood, and its captain, Luis Pardo Villalon, was a man of immense courage and skill. He volunteered for the mission without hesitation. This was it, the fourth and final attempt. There would be no more chances after this. As the Yelcho steamed out of Punta Arenas on August 25, 1916, there was a sense that this was all or nothing. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean stood on its deck, their faces turned south once more. They knew the ship was inadequate. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew there was a temporary break in the weather, a small window of opportunity. The pack ice, for reasons known only to the currents and the winds, had been pushed west. A channel might be open. They pushed the little tug as hard as it would go. The conditions were appalling. Waves crashed over the bow, the sea spray turning the entire ship into an ice sculpture. The men had no heat, no comfort. They lived on hope and hot coffee. For days they steamed south, into the eerie twilight of the Antarctic late winter. Shackleton barely slept. He lived on the bridge, scanning the horizon, his anxiety a burning fire in his chest. And then they saw it, Elephant Island, a black smudge on the horizon crowned with ice. Unbelievably, the sea was relatively clear, the channel was open, the fickle Antarctic had for a moment lowered its guard. As they drew closer, Worsley's brilliant navigation guided them directly towards the spit of land where they had left the men. Shackleton scanned the shore with his binoculars, his heart in his throat. What would he find? Had they survived? Had they succumbed to illness, or accident, or despair? The beach looked empty. For one horrifying moment, he thought they were too late. But then he saw it, a figure, running from the makeshift hut. Then another, and another. Men were pouring out onto the beach, waving through the binoculars. Shackleton could see one man. It was Frank Wild, climbing to a high point and waving his jacket. They were alive. They were all alive. Shackleton put a megaphone to his lips. He called out across the water, the most important question of his life. "Are you all well?" The answer came back across the churning grey water, a faint cry against the wind. All well, all safe. The relief was so immense, so total, that it was almost a physical blow. They had done it. On the fourth attempt, against all logic and all odds, they had broken through. A boat was lowered, and as it neared the shore, the men waded out to meet it, their faces blackened by blubber smoke, their hair long and matted, their clothes in rags. They were gaunt and thin, but they were standing. Not a single man had been lost. Frank Wild, ever the stoic, calmly shook Shackleton's hand. "I knew you'd come back," he said simply. That unshakable faith was the fuel they had lived on for 4 long, dark months. Within an hour, all 22 men were aboard the Yelcho. They left nothing behind but the upturned boats and a few sealskins. They didn't even look back. As the little tug turned north, a vast fog bank rolled in behind them, shrouding the island in mist. The window had closed. They had slipped through just in time. The rescue was so clean, so swift. It felt like a miracle, and in many ways it was. A miracle born of one man's absolute, unbreakable refusal to abandon his crew. But while this incredible drama was playing out, while the world would soon celebrate Shackleton's triumphant return with all his men from the Weddell Sea party, another story of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition was reaching its own agonizing conclusion. A story that was happening on the opposite side of the planet, in silence and obscurity. A story of equal hardship, equal heroism, and far greater tragedy. This was the story of the Ross Sea party. They were the other half of the grand plan. While Shackleton and the Endurance were meant to push in from the Weddell Sea, the Ross Sea party was tasked with sailing to the other side of Antarctica, to the Ross Sea. Their mission was, in its own way, just as crucial. They were to march inland from the coast, across the Great Ice Barrier, what we now call the Ross Ice Shelf, and lay a series of supply depots all the way to the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. These depots would be the lifeline for Shackleton's party, providing them with the food and fuel they would need for the final desperate 400-mile leg of their transcontinental journey. Think about that for a moment. Their job was to act as a support crew for a main event that hadn't even started yet. They were opening a restaurant on a street that hadn't been built, for a customer who might never show up. The psychological burden of that is immense. Their leader was Aeneas Mackintosh, a man who had been with Shackleton on a previous expedition, where he had lost an eye in an accident. He was brave and determined, but perhaps not the most meticulous planner. His ship was the Aurora, an old vessel that had seen better days. His crew was a collection of scientists and sailors, some experienced, some startlingly green. They arrived at the Ross Sea in early 1915 and set up their base at Cape Evans, in the very hut that Captain Scott had used on his fateful final expedition. The ghosts of that tragedy were literally all around them. They immediately set about their task, undertaking a preliminary journey to lay the first couple of depots. It was a brutal introduction to the realities of Antarctic sledging. The dogs were in poor condition, the men were inexperienced, and the weather was vicious. They accomplished their goal, but at a high cost, losing most of their dogs. It was a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. They returned to the Aurora, which was moored at Cape Evans for the winter, and it was here that their mission and their lives were irrevocably shattered. In May 1915, a blizzard of almost unimaginable ferocity descended upon them. The wind screamed at over 100 miles an hour. The mooring lines holding the Aurora to the shore, thick as a man's arm, were strained to their breaking point. Then, with a series of reports like cannon shots, they snapped. The ship, with 18 men and the vast majority of the shore party's supplies, clothing, fuel and equipment, was ripped from its mooring and blown out to sea. It was trapped in the pack ice. A helpless prisoner. A small party of 10 men, led by Mackintosh, had been on shore, stranded. They watched their ship, their connection to the outside world, their very means of survival, disappear into the swirling snow of the blizzard. Imagine the silence that fell after the wind died down. The 10 men stood on the shore, looking out at an empty sea. Their ship was gone. Their food was gone. Their proper winter clothing was gone. They were marooned on the harshest continent on Earth, with little more than the summer clothes on their backs, and a few meagre supplies. It was a catastrophe. In our modern world, this is the point where you press the emergency beacon, where you call for extraction. But there was no beacon. No one in the world even knew what had happened. They were utterly, completely alone. A lesser group of men would have despaired. They would have hunkered down, tried to survive, and waited for a rescue that would likely never come. But these were men of a different era, possessed of a sense of duty that is almost incomprehensible to us today. Mackintosh gathered his small, shattered party. Their situation was desperate, but in his mind, Shackleton's situation was even more so. The boss and his party would be walking across the continent. They would be starving, exhausted, and frostbitten. If those depots were not in place, Shackleton and his men would surely die. Their own survival was secondary. The mission came first. They had a duty to fulfill, and they would do it, even if it killed them. And so began one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in the history of exploration. They turned to the ghosts of the past for their salvation. They scavenged Captain Scott's old hut at Cape Evans, a place left almost exactly as it was when the last members of that expedition departed years earlier. They found old clothes, some discarded equipment, a small amount of food. They patched together trousers from the canvas cover of a billiard table. They fashioned harnesses from old ropes. They were making do, improvising a survival plan from the scraps left behind by dead men. Their plan was simple, and bordering on suicidal. They would undertake the main depot-laying journey as scheduled. They would haul hundreds of pounds of supplies on sledges for hundreds of miles across the Ross Ice Shelf, all the way to the Beardmore Glacier, wearing patched-together clothes and surviving on scavenged rations. It was a journey that would have been fantastically difficult, with the best of modern equipment. For them, it was a death sentence they willingly signed up for. The party consisted of Mackintosh, the indefatigable sledging veteran Ernest Joyce, the young and resilient Dick Richards, the expedition's chaplain and photographer Arnold Spencer Smith, and a handful of others. In September 1915 they set out. The journey was a descent into a special kind of hell. The surface of the Ross Ice Shelf is not a smooth, flat plain. It is a landscape of sastrugi, hard, wind-sculpted ridges of snow, sometimes several feet high, that lie at right angles to the direction of travel. Pulling a heavy sledge over this is like dragging a grand piano through a ploughed field. It is relentless, soul-destroying work. The temperatures were 50, 60 degrees below zero. The wind was a constant physical presence, scouring any exposed skin and finding its way through every seam of their inadequate makeshift clothing. Their diet was appalling. They had a primer stove for melting snow and cooking their horse, a thin stew of pemmican and biscuit, but their fuel was limited. Their food was monotonous, and crucially, it lacked vitamin C. Slowly, insidiously, scurvy began to take hold. It is a vile, cruel disease. It starts with a feeling of lethargy, a deep weariness in the bones. Then the gums begin to swell and turn black, becoming spongy and sore. Teeth loosen in their sockets. Old wounds, even those that have been healed for years, can spontaneously reopen. The joints ache with a deep, throbbing pain. The mind becomes clouded with depression and paranoia. It is a slow, agonizing decay of the body's connective tissues. Arnold Spencer Smith, the chaplain, was the first to show severe symptoms. His legs swelled up, and he found it increasingly difficult to walk. But he refused to be a burden. He would march until he collapsed, get up, and march again. Soon, however, he could not walk at all. Did they turn back? No. The mission was not complete. They placed him on one of the sledges, adding his body weight to the immense load they were already pulling, and they pushed on. Spencer Smith, lying on his back, would try to cheer the others on, his spirit unbroken even as his body failed. Mackintosh, the leader, also began to fail. His gums were bleeding, his legs were swelling. He too was weakening day by day. The party was now being driven forward by the sheer willpower of a few healthy men, primarily Joyce and Richards. They were now in a race against death. They had to lay that final depot at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, at 83 degrees 30 minutes south. It was the last link in the chain that would save Shackleton. They reached their goal at the end of January 1916. They had hauled the supplies over 400 miles from their base. They built the cairn of snow, left the food and fuel, and turned for home. They had done their job, but now they had to survive the return journey. And they were a party of broken men. The journey back was a nightmare. They were starving, exhausted, and in the advanced stages of scurvy. Spencer Smith was completely incapacitated, a dead weight on the sledge. Mackintosh could barely walk. Another man, Hayward, was also beginning to collapse. The burden fell on Joyce, Richards, and another man named Wild, Frank Wild's brother as it happens, to pull the sledges and the invalids. The weather turned against them. They were trapped in their tent for days by a blizzard, their meagre rations dwindling. Spencer Smith was fading fast. Lying in the freezing tent, he remained calm and devout, his faith a source of strength, not just for him but for the others. He knew he was dying, but he never complained. He would even ask for his opium dose to be reduced so it could be saved for the others who might need it more. Finally, there was a break in the storm, and they pushed on. But it was too late for the chaplain. On March 9th, 1916, Arnold Spencer Smith died quietly in the tent. He had endured unimaginable suffering without a word of complaint, driven by his faith and his sense of duty. They buried him there, in the vast empty whiteness of the ice shelf, building a small cairn and a cross to mark his grave. His death seemed to break what was left of Mackintosh's spirit. He was now unable to walk at all. Hayward, too, was near the end. They were still miles from safety at Hut Point. Joyce and Richards, themselves starving and exhausted, were now faced with an impossible choice. To stay with the invalids meant they would all die. Their only hope was for the strongest to make a desperate dash for the safety of the hut, and then return for the others. So Joyce, Richards and Wild left Mackintosh and Hayward in a small tent with the last of the food and fuel. They promised they would return, and then they set off, a desperate, staggering march for life. They were skeletal figures, their faces black with frostbite and soot, their eyes wild with hunger. They reached Hut Point, delirious with exhaustion, and collapsed. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. They had survived. They had done more than could be asked of any human being. But they had made a promise. After only a few days of rest, eating seal meat to regain their strength, Joyce and Richards loaded up a sledge with supplies and went back out onto the ice shelf. They went back into the blizzard-swept hell they had just escaped to rescue their comrades. It is an act of loyalty and courage that almost defies belief. They found the tent, and miraculously, Mackintosh and Hayward were still alive. They sledged them back to the hut, completing one of the most astonishing rescue missions ever undertaken. The entire depot-laying party, or what was left of it, was finally safe. They had spent months on the ice shelf. They had travelled over 1,500 miles, a distance greater than walking from London to Moscow. They had laid every single depot. They had fulfilled their mission to the letter, and they had lost one of their own in the process. But their ordeal was not over. They were at Hut Point, but their main base with the other members of the shore party was at Cape Evans, a dozen miles away across the frozen sea ice. The ice was still unstable, prone to breaking up. Joyce, the experienced Antarctic hand, insisted they wait until the winter ice was solid, but Mackintosh, having recovered some of his strength, grew impatient. He was the leader, and he wanted to get back to the main hut. On May 8, 1916, against Joyce's strenuous advice, Mackintosh and Hayward decided to risk the walk to Cape Evans. The weather was calm, though the light was poor. They set off across the sea ice. A blizzard blew up soon after they left. It raged for 2 days. When it finally cleared, the men at Hut Point searched for their companions. They found their tracks leading out across the ice. And then the tracks simply stopped. The ice beyond had broken up and blown out to sea. Mackintosh and Hayward were gone, vanished. It was the final, cruel, pointless tragedy. After surviving scurvy, starvation, and the horrors of the ice shelf, a simple moment of impatience had cost them their lives. The remaining survivors waited. The months dragged on. They lived in Scott's hut, hunting seals and penguins, waiting. They had no idea what had happened to their ship, the Aurora. They had no idea what had happened to Shackleton. They simply existed, ghosts in a ghost-haunted hut, at the end of the world. And what of the Aurora? After being blown out to sea, she had been trapped in the ice for nearly a year, drifting helplessly for over 1,000 miles. Her crew endured their own epic of survival, until the ice finally released its grip, and they were able to limp to New Zealand. It was only then, in late 1916, that the world learned of the Ross Sea Party's plight. A relief expedition was organised. The repaired Aurora sailed south one last time. In January 1917, nearly 2 years after being stranded, the 7 surviving members of the shore party saw the ship appear on the horizon. They were rescued. As they sailed north, they were finally told the news. The Endurance had been crushed in the ice. Shackleton had never even set foot on the Antarctic continent. The transcontinental crossing had never even begun. Their entire journey, the suffering, the scurvy, the starvation, the deaths of Spencer Smith, Mackintosh, and Hayward, the 1,500 miles of man-hauling sledges, it had all been for nothing. The depots they had laid at such a terrible cost had waited for a party that never came. It is a story so filled with tragic irony that it's almost hard to bear. A failed expedition in support of a failed expedition. But to call it a failure is to miss the point entirely. What they accomplished stands as one of the greatest feats of human endurance in history. They fulfilled their duty as they saw it. To the very last, Dick Richards, one of the heroes who had survived it all, would later say simply, "Every man did his duty." And so the story of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition comes to a close. It was a glorious failure. Shackleton's primary objective was not met, but in the end, that's not what we remember. We remember the boat journey of the James Caird. We remember the 4 attempts to rescue the men on Elephant Island. We remember the grim, heroic sacrifice of the Ross Sea Party. Shackleton had promised his men, "If you are stranded on one shore, I will come for you from the other." He had told their families he would ensure their safe return. Of the 28 men who had sailed on the Endurance, he brought all 28 back alive. Of the 10 men stranded from the Aurora, 7 survived. It was a record of survival, in the face of impossible odds, that has never been equalled. The expedition's motto was Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. They did not conquer the continent of Antarctica, but they conquered something far greater, the limits of human suffering, the depths of despair, and the temptation to give up. They conquered themselves. And in the process they left behind not a story of geography, but a timeless, enduring testament to leadership, to loyalty, and to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. A story that proves that even in the most profound failure, there can be a victory that echoes for generations. No man was abandoned. The mission, in the end, was complete.